Hello, dear friends. I've just released a new audiobook narration. Enjoy listening. Night Shots by Dashiell Hammett. Mr. Hammett's nameless detective is lured into a sweet little domestic mess with an outside mystery. As usual, he walks into a lot of excitement, not all of which comes from the muzzle of a gun. 1. The house was of red brick, large and square, with a green slate roof, whose wide overhang gave the building an appearance of being too squat for its 2 stories, and it stood on a grassy hill well away from the county road, upon which it turned its back to look down on the Mokelumne River. The Ford that I had hired to bring me out from Nürnberg carried me into the grounds through a high steel-meshed gate, followed the circling gravel drive, and set me down within a foot of the screened porch that ran all the way around the house's first floor. "There's Exxon's son-in-law now," the driver told me, as he pocketed the bill I had given him and prepared to drive away. I turned to see a tall, loose-jointed man of 30 or so coming across the porch toward me, a carelessly dressed man with a mop of rumpled brown hair over a handsome sunburned face. There was a hint of cruelty in the lips that were smiling lazily just now, and more than a hint of recklessness in his narrow gray eyes. "Mr. Galloway?" I asked as he came down the steps. "Yes?" His voice was a drawling baritone. "You are from the Continental Detective Agency's San Francisco branch," I finished for him. He nodded and held the screen door open for me. "Just leave your bag there. I'll have it taken up to your room." He guided me into the house, and after I had assured him that I had already eaten luncheon, gave me a soft chair and an excellent cigar. He sprawled on his spine in an armchair opposite me, all loose-jointed angles sticking out of it in every direction, and blew smoke at the ceiling for several thoughtful minutes. "First off," he began presently, his words coming out languidly, "I may as well tell you that I don't expect very much in the way of results. I sent for you more for the soothing effect of your presence on the household than because I expect you to do anything. I don't believe there's anything to do. However, I'm not a detective. I may be wrong. You may find out all sorts of more or less important things. If you do, fine. But I don't insist upon it." I didn't say anything, though this beginning wasn't much to my taste. He smoked in silence for a moment, and then went on. "My father-in-law, Talbot Exxon, is a man of 57, and ordinarily a tough, hard, active, and fiery old devil. But just now he's recovering from a rather serious attack of pneumonia, which has taken most of the starch out of him. He hasn't been able to leave his bed yet, and I understand that Dr. Wrench hopes to keep him on his back for another week, at the very least. The old man has a room on the 2nd floor, the front right-hand corner room, just over where we are sitting. His nurse, Miss Kaywood, occupies the next room, and there is a connecting door between. My room is the other front one, just across the hall from the old man's, and my wife's bedroom is next to mine, across the hall from the nurse's. I'll show you around later. I just want to make the situation clear to you first. Last night, or rather this morning, at about 1:30, somebody shot at Exxon while he was sleeping, and missed. The bullet went into the frame of the door that leads to his nurse's room, about 6 inches above his body as he lay in bed. The course the bullet took in the woodwork would indicate that it had been fired from one of the windows, either through it or from just inside. Exxon woke up, of course, but he saw nobody. The rest of us, my wife, Miss Kaywood, the Figs, and myself, were also awakened by the shot. We all rushed into his room, and we saw nothing either. There's no doubt that whoever fired it left by the window, otherwise some of us would have seen him. We came from every other direction. However, we found nobody on the grounds, and no traces of anybody. That, I think, is all. Who are the Figs? And who else is there on the place besides you and your wife, Mr. Exxon, and his nurse? The Figs are Adam and Emma. She is the housekeeper, and he is a sort of handyman about the place. Their room is in the extreme rear on the second floor. Besides them, there is Gong Lim, the cook, who sleeps in a little room near the kitchen, and the 3 farm hands. Joe Natara and Felipe Fadelia are Italians and have been here for possibly more than 2 years. Jesus Mesa, a Mexican, has been here a year or longer. The farm hands sleep in a little house near the barns. I think, if my opinion is of any value, that none of these people had anything to do with the shooting. Did you dig the bullet out of the door frame? Yes. Shand, the deputy sheriff at Nürnberg, dug it out. He says it is a .38 caliber bullet. Any guns of that caliber in the house? No. A .22 and my .44, which I keep in the car, are the only pistols on the place. Then there are 2 shotguns and a .30-30 rifle. Shand made a thorough search and found nothing else in the way of firearms. What does Mr. Exxon say? Not much of anything, except that if we'll put a gun in bed with him, he'll manage to take care of himself without bothering any policemen or detectives. I don't know whether he knows who shot at him or not. He's a close-mouthed old devil. From what I know of him, I imagine there are quite a few men who would think themselves justified in killing him. He was, I understand, far from being a lily in his youth, or in his mature years either, for that matter. Anything definite, you know, or are you guessing? Galloway grinned at me, a mocking grin that I was to see often before I was through with this Exxon affair. Both, he drawled. I know that his life has been rather more than sprinkled with swindled partners and betrayed friends, and that he saved himself from prison at least once by turning state's evidence and sending his associates there. And I know that his wife died under rather peculiar circumstances while heavily insured, and that he was for some time held on suspicion of having murdered her, but was finally released because of a lack of evidence against him. Those, I understand, are fair samples of the old boy's normal behavior, so there may be any number of people gunning for him. Suppose you give me a list of all the names you know of enemies he's made, and I'll have them checked up and see what we can find that way. He raised an indolent hand in protest. The names I could give you would be only a few in many, and it might take you months to check up those few. It isn't my intention to go to all that trouble and expense. As I told you, I'm not insisting upon results. My wife is very nervous, and for some peculiar reason, she seems to like the old man. So to soothe her, I agreed to employ a private detective when she asked me to. My idea is that you hang around for a couple of days until things quiet down and she feels safe again. Meanwhile, if you should stumble upon anything, go to it. If you don't, well and good. My face must have shown something of what I was thinking, for his eyes twinkled, and he chuckled banteringly. "Don't, please," he drawled. "Get the idea that you aren't to find my father-in-law's would-be assassin if you wish to. You're to have a free hand. Go as far as you like, except that I want you to be around the place as much as possible, so my wife will see you and feel that we are being adequately protected. Beyond that, I don't care what you do. You can apprehend criminals by the carload. As you may have gathered by now, I'm not exactly in love with my wife's father, and he's no more fond of me. To be frank, if hating weren't such an effort, if it didn't require so much energy, I think I should hate the old devil. But if you want to, and can, catch the man who shot at him. I'd be glad to have you do it. But, all right, I said. I don't like this job much, but since I'm up here, I'll take it on. But remember, I'm trying all the time. Sincerity and earnestness. He showed his teeth in a sardonic smile as we got to our feet. Are very praiseworthy traits. So I hear. I growled shortly. Now, let's take a look at Mr. Exxon's room. Galloway's wife and the nurse were with the invalid, but I examined the room before I asked the occupants any questions. It was a large room with 3 wide windows opening over the porch, and 2 doors, one of which gave to the hall, and the other to the adjoining room occupied by the nurse. This door stood open, with a green Japanese screen across it, and, I was told, was left that way at night, so that the nurse could hear readily if her patient was restless or if he wanted attention. A man standing on the slate roof of the porch, I found, could have easily leaned across one of the window sills, if he did not care to step over it into the room, and fired at the man in the bed. To get from the ground to the porch roof would have required but little effort, and the descent would be still easier. He could slide down the roof, let himself go feet first over the edge, checking his speed with hands and arms spread out on the slate, and drop down to the gravel drive. No trick at all, either coming or going. The windows were unscreened. The sick man's bed stood just beside the connecting doorway between his room and the nurse's, which, when he was lying down, placed him between the doorway and the window from which the shot had been fired. Outside, within long rifle range, there was no building, tree, or eminence of any character from which the bullet that had been dug out of the door frame could have been fired. I turned from the room to the occupants, questioning the invalid first. He had been a raw-boned man of considerable size in his health, but now he was wasted and stringy and dead white. His face was thin and hollow. Small, beady eyes crowded together against the thin bridge of his nose. His mouth was a colorless gash above a bony, projecting chin. His statement was a marvel of petulant conciseness. The shot woke me. I didn't see anything. I don't know anything. I've got a million enemies, most of whose names I can't remember. That's all I can tell you. He jerked this out crossly, turned his face away, closed his eyes, and refused to speak again. Mrs. Galloway and the nurse followed me into the latter's room, where I questioned them. They were of as opposite type as you could find anywhere, and between them there was a certain coolness, an unmistakable hostility, which I was able to account for later in the day. Mrs. Galloway was perhaps 5 years older than her husband. Dark, strikingly beautiful in a statuesque way, with a worried look in her dark eyes that was particularly noticeable when those eyes rested on her husband. There was no doubt that she was very much in love with him, and the anxiety that showed in her eyes at times, the pains she took to please him in each slight thing during my stay at the Exxon house, convinced me that she struggled always with a fear that she would not be able to hold him, that she was about to lose him. Mrs. Galloway could add nothing to what her husband had told me. She had been awakened by the shot, had run to her father's room, had seen nothing, knew nothing, suspected nothing. The nurse, Barbara Kaywood was her name, told the same story, in almost the same words. She had jumped out of bed when awakened by the shot, pushed the screen away from the connecting doorway, and rushed into her patient's room. She was the first one to arrive there, and she had seen nothing but the old man sitting up in bed, roaring and shaking his feeble fists at the window. This Barbara Kaywood was a girl of 21 or 2, and just the sort that a man would pick to help him get well. A girl of a little under the average height, with an erect figure wherein slimness and roundness got an even break under the stiff white of her uniform, with soft golden hair above a face that was certainly made to be looked at. But she was businesslike and had an air of efficiency, for all her prettiness. From the nurse's room, Galloway led me to the kitchen, where I questioned the Chinese cook. Gong Lim was a sad-faced Oriental, whose ever-present smile somehow made him look more gloomy than ever, and he bowed and smiled and yes-yes'd me from start to finish, and told me nothing. Adam and Emma Fig, thin and stout, respectively, and both rheumatic, entertained a wide variety of suspicions, directed at the cook and the farm hands, individually and collectively, flitting momentarily from one to the other. They had nothing upon which to base these suspicions, however, except their firm belief that nearly all crimes of violence were committed by foreigners, which, while enough for them, didn't satisfy me. The farmhands, 2 smiling middle-aged and heavily mustached Italians, and a soft-eyed Mexican youth, I found in one of the fields. I talked to them for nearly 2 hours, and I left with a reasonable amount of assurance that neither of the 3 had had any part in the shooting. 2. Dr. Wrench had just come down from a visit to his patient when Galloway and I returned from the fields. He was a little, wizened old man with mild manners and eyes, and a wonderful growth of hair on head, brows, cheeks, lips, chin, and nostrils. The excitement, he said, had retarded Exxon's recovery somewhat, but he did not think the setback would be serious. The invalid's temperature had gone up a little, but he seemed to be improving now. I followed Dr. Wrench out to his machine after he left the others, for a few questions I wanted to put to him in privacy. But the questions might as well have gone unasked for all the good they did me. He could tell me nothing of any value. The nurse, Barbara Kaywood, had been secured, he said, from San Francisco through the usual channels, which made it seem unlikely that she had worked her way into the Exxon house for any hidden purpose which might have some connection with the attempt upon Exxon's life. Returning from my talk with the doctor, I came upon Hilary Galloway and the nurse in the hall near the foot of the stairs. His arm was resting lightly across her shoulders, and he was smiling down at her. Just as I came through the door, she twisted away so that his arm slid off, laughed elfishly up into his face, and went on up the stairs. I did not know whether she had seen me approaching before she eluded the encircling arm or not, nor did I know how long the arm had been there. And both of those questions would make a difference in how their positions were to be construed. Hilary Galloway was certainly not a man to allow a girl as pretty as the nurse to lack attention, and he was just as certainly attractive enough in himself to make his advances not too unflattering. Nor did Barbara Kaywood impress me as being a girl who would dislike his admiration. But at that, it was more than likely that there was nothing very serious between them, nothing more than a playful sort of flirtation. But no matter what the situation might be in that quarter, it didn't have any direct bearing upon the shooting, none that I could see anyway. But I understood now the strained relations between the nurse and Galloway's wife. Galloway was grinning quizzically at me while I was chasing these thoughts around in my head. "Nobody's safe with a detective around," he complained. I grinned back at him. That was the only sort of an answer you could give this bird. After dinner, Galloway drove me to Nürnberg in his roadster and set me down on the doorstep of the deputy sheriff's house. He offered to drive me back to the Exxon house when I had finished my investigations in town, but I did not know how long those investigations would take, so I told him I would hire a car when I was ready to return. Shand, the deputy sheriff, was a big, slow-spoken, slow-thinking blond man of 30 or so, just the type best fitted for a deputy sheriff job in a San Joaquin County town, and he balanced a fat blonde child on each knee while he talked to me. "I went out to Exxon's as soon as Galloway called me up," he said. "About 4:30 in the morning, I reckon it was, when I got there. I didn't find nothing. There weren't no marks on the porch roof, but that don't mean nothing. I tried climbing up and down it myself, and I didn't leave no marks neither. The ground around the house is too firm for footprints to be followed. I found a few, but they didn't lead nowhere, and everybody had run all over the place before I got there, so I couldn't tell who they belonged to. Far as I can learn, there ain't been no suspicious characters in the neighborhood lately. The only folks around here who have got any grudge against the old man are the Deemses. Exxon beat him in a lawsuit a couple years back. But all of them, the father and both the boys, were at home when the shooting was done." "How long has Exxon been living here?" "4, 5 years, I reckon. Came in 1918 or 19. Nothing at all to work on then." He shifted one of the kids around to keep from having an eye jabbed by a stubby finger and shook his head. "Nothing I know about." "What do you know about the Exxon family?" I asked. Shand scratched his head thoughtfully and frowned. "I reckon it's Hilary Galloway you're meaning," he said slowly. "I thought of that. The Galloways showed up here a couple of years after her father had bought the place, and Hilary seems to spend most of his evenings up in Addie's back room teaching the boys how to play poker. I hear he's fitted to teach them a lot. I don't know myself. Addie runs a quiet game, so I let him alone. But naturally, I don't never set in myself. I just stay away, so I won't see nothing. Outside of being a card hound and drinking pretty heavy and making a lot of trips to the city where he's supposed to have a girl on the string, I don't know nothing much about Hilary. But it's no secret that him and the old man don't hit it off together very well. And then Hilary's room is just across the hall from Exxon's, and their windows open out on the porch roof just a little apart. But I don't know." Shand confirmed what Galloway had told me about the bullet being .38 caliber. about the absence of any pistol of that caliber on the premises, and about the lack of any reason for suspecting the farmhands or servants. I put in the next couple hours talking to whomever I could find to talk to in Nürnberg, and I learned nothing worth putting down on paper. Then I got a car and driver from the garage and was driven out to Exxon's. Galloway had not yet returned from town. His wife and Barbara Kaywood were just about to sit down to a light luncheon before retiring, so I joined them. Exxon, the nurse said, was asleep, and had spent a quiet evening. We talked for a while, until about 12:30, and then went to our rooms. My room was next to the nurse's, on the same side of the hall that divided the second story in half. I sat down and wrote my report for the day, smoked a cigar, and then, the house being quiet by this time, put a gun and a flashlight in my pockets, went downstairs, and let myself out of the kitchen door. The moon was just coming up, lighting the grounds vaguely, except for the shadows cast by house, outbuildings, and the several clumps of shrubbery. Keeping in these shadows as much as possible, I explored the grounds, finding everything as it should be. The lack of any evidence to the contrary pointed to last night's shot having been fired, either accidentally or in fright at some fancied move of Exxon's, by a burglar who had been entering the sick man's room through a window. If that was so, then there wasn't one chance in 1,000 of anything happening tonight. But I felt restless and ill at ease nevertheless, possibly a result of my failure to learn the least thing of importance all day. Galloway's roadster was not in the garage. He had not returned from Nürnberg. Beneath the farmhand's window I paused until snores in 3 distinct keys told me they were all safely abed. After an hour of this snooping around, I returned to the house. The luminous dial of my watch registered 2:35 as I stopped outside the Chinese cook's door to listen to his regular breathing. Upstairs, I paused at the door of the Figs room until my ear told me that they were sleeping. At Mrs. Galloway's door, I had to wait several minutes before she sighed and turned in bed. Barbara Kaywood was breathing deeply and strongly, with the regularity of a young animal whose sleep is without disturbing dreams. The invalid's breath came to me with the evenness of slumber and the rasping of the pneumonia convalescent. This listening tour completed, I returned to my room. Still feeling wide awake and restless, I pulled a chair up to a window and sat looking at the moonlight on the river, which twisted just below the house so as to be visible from this side, smoking another cigar, and turning things over in my mind, to no great advantage. Outside, there was no sound. Suddenly, down the hall, came the heavy explosion of a gun being fired indoors. I threw myself across the room, out into the hall. A woman's voice filled the house with its shriek, high, frenzied. Barbara Kaywood's door was unlocked when I reached it. I slammed it open. By the light of the moonbeams that slanted past her window, I saw her sitting upright in the center of her bed. She wasn't beautiful now. Her face was distorted, twisted with terror. The scream was just dying in her throat. All this I got in the flash of time that it took me to put a running foot across her sill. Then another shot crashed out, in Exxon's room. The girl's face jerked up, so abruptly that it seemed her neck must snap. She clutched both hands to her breast and fell face down among the bedclothes. I don't know whether I went through, over, or around the screen that stood in the connecting doorway. I was circling Exxon's bed. He lay on the floor on his side, facing a window. I jumped over him, leaned out the window. In the yard, that was bright now under the moon. Nothing moved. There was no sound of flight. Presently, while my eyes still searched the surrounding country, the farmhands, in their underwear, came running barefooted from the direction of their quarters. I called down to them, stationing them at points of vantage. Meanwhile, behind me, Gong Lim and Adam Figg had put Exxon back in his bed, while Mrs. Galloway and Emma Figg tried to check the blood that spurted from a hole in Barbara Kaywood's side. I sent Adam Figg to the telephone to wake the doctor and the deputy sheriff, and then I hurried down to the grounds. Stepping out the door, I came face to face with Hilary Galloway, coming from the direction of the garage. His face was flushed, and his breath was eloquent of the refreshments that had accompanied the game in Addie's back room, but his step was steady enough, and his smile was as lazy as ever. He had apparently arrived while I was sending Figg to the phone and running downstairs. Otherwise, I would have heard his car. "What's the excitement?" he asked. "Same as last night? Meet anybody on the road, or see anybody leaving here?" "No." "All right. Get in that bus of yours and burn up the road in the other direction. Stop anybody you meet going away from here or who looks wrong. Got a gun?" He spun on his heel with nothing of indolence. "One in my car," he called over his shoulder as he broke into a run. The farmhands, still at their posts, I combed the grounds from east to west and from north to south. I realized that I was spoiling my chance of finding footprints when it would be light enough to see them, but I was banking on the man I wanted still being close at hand. And then Shand had told me that the ground was unfavorable for tracing prints anyway. On the gravel drive in front of the house, I found the pistol from which the shots had been fired. A cheap .38 caliber revolver, slightly rusty, smelling freshly of burnt powder, with 3 empty shells and 3 that had not been fired in it. Besides that, I found nothing. The murderer, from what I had seen of the hole in the girl's side, I called him that, had vanished completely. Shand and Dr. Wrench arrived together just as I was finishing my fruitless search. A little later, Hilary Galloway came back, empty-handed. 3. Breakfast that morning was a melancholy meal, except to Hilary Galloway. He refrained from jesting openly about the night's excitement, but his eyes twinkled whenever they met mine, and I knew he thought it a tremendously good joke for the shooting to have taken place right under my nose. During his wife's presence at the table, however, he was almost grave, as if not to offend her. Mrs. Galloway left the table shortly, and Dr. Wrench joined us. He said that both of his patients were in as good shape as could be expected, and he thought both would recover. The bullet had barely grazed the girl's ribs and breastbone, going through the flesh and muscles of her chest, in on the right side, and out again on the left. Except for the shock and the loss of blood, she was not in danger, although she was still unconscious. Exxon was sleeping, the doctor said, so Shand and I crept up into his room to examine it. The first bullet had gone into the door frame, about 4 inches above the one that had been fired the night before. The second bullet had pierced the Japanese screen, and after passing through the girl, had lodged in the plaster of the wall. We dug out both bullets. They were of .38 caliber. Both had been apparently fired from the vicinity of one of the windows, either just inside or just outside. Shand and I grilled the Chinese cook, the farmhands, and the Figgs unmercifully that day. Detectives are only human, or at least this one is, And I don't mind confessing that some of my humiliation and chagrin was worked off on these people. But they came through it standing up. There was nothing to fix the shooting on any of them. And all day long that damned Hilary Galloway followed me from pillar to post, with a mocking glint in his eyes that said plainer than words, "I'm the logical suspect. Why don't you put me through your little third degree?" But I grinned back and asked him nothing. Shand had to go to town that afternoon. He called me up on the telephone later and told me that Galloway had left Nonberg early enough that morning to have arrived home fully half an hour before the shooting, if he had driven at his usual fast pace. The day passed too rapidly, and I found myself dreading the coming of night. 2 nights in succession, Exxon's life had been attempted, and now the 3rd night was coming. At dinner, Hilary Galloway announced that he was going to stay home this evening. Nonberg, he said, was tame in comparison, and he grinned at me. Dr. Wrench left after the meal, saying that he would return as soon as possible, but that he had 2 patients on the other side of town whom he must visit. Barbara Kaywood had returned to consciousness, but had been extremely hysterical, and the doctor had given her an opiate. She was asleep now. Exxon was resting easily, except for a high temperature. I went up to Exxon's room for a few minutes after the meal and tried him out with a gentle question or two, but he refused to answer them, and he was too sick for me to press him. He asked how the girl was. "The doc says she's in no particular danger, just loss of blood and shock. If she doesn't rip her bandages off and bleed to death in one of her hysterical spells, he says, he'll have her on her feet in a couple weeks." Mrs. Galloway came in then, and I went downstairs again, where I was seized by Galloway, who insisted with bantering gravity that I tell him about some of the mysteries I had solved. He was enjoying my discomfort to the limit. He kidded me for about an hour and had me burning up inside, but I managed to grin back with a fair pretense of indifference. When his wife joined us presently, saying that both of the invalids were sleeping, I made my escape from her tormenting husband, saying that I had some writing to do, but I didn't go to my room. Instead, I crept stealthily into the girls' room, crossed to a clothes press that I had noted earlier in the day, and planted myself in it. By leaving the door open the least fraction of an inch, I could see through the connecting doorway, from which the screen had been removed, across Exxon's bed, and out of the window, from which 3 bullets had already come, and the Lord only knew what else might come. Time passed, and I was stiff from standing still. But I had expected that, had felt it before on somewhat similar occasions, and I knew it would pass. But whether it did or not, I meant to stay here until something happened, even if it was only the rising of the sun. Nothing else was going to be pulled off in this corner of the house without my being in on it. Twice, Mrs. Galloway came up to look at her father and the nurse. Each time I shut my closet door entirely as soon as I heard her tiptoeing steps in the hall. I was hiding from everybody. She had just gone from her second visit when, before I had time to open my door again, I heard a faint rustling and a soft padding on the floor. Not knowing what it was or where it was, I was afraid to push the door open. In my narrow hiding place, I stood still and waited. The padding was recognizable now. Quiet footsteps, coming nearer. They passed not far from my clothes press door. I waited. An almost inaudible rustling, a pause, the softest and faintest of tearing sounds. I came out of the closet, my gun in my hand. Standing beside the girl's bed, leaning over her unconscious form, was old Talbot Exxon, his face flushed with fever, his nightshirt hanging limply around his wasted legs. One of his hands still rested upon the bedclothes he had turned down from her body. The other hand held a narrow strip of adhesive tape, with which her bandages had been fixed in place, and which he had just torn off. He snarled at me, and both his hands went toward the girl's bandages. The crazy, feverish glare of his eyes told me that the threat of the gun in my hand meant nothing to him. I jumped to his side, plucked his hands aside, picked him up in my arms, and carried him, kicking, clawing, and swearing, back to his bed. Then I called the others. 4. Hilary Galloway, Chand, who had come out from town again, and I sat over coffee and cigarettes in the kitchen, while the rest of the household helped Dr. Wrench battle for Exxon's life. The old man had gone through enough excitement in the last 3 days to kill a healthy man, let alone a pneumonia convalescent. But why should the old devil want to kill her? Galloway asked me. Search me, I confessed, a little testily perhaps. I don't know why he wanted to kill her, but it's a cinch that he did. The gun was found just about where he could have thrown it when he heard me coming. I was in the girl's room when she was shot, and I got to Exxon's window without wasting much time, and I saw nothing. You yourself, driving home from Nürnberg and arriving here right after the shooting, didn't see anybody leave by the road. And I'll take an oath that nobody could have left in any other direction without either one of the farmhands or me seeing them. And then, tonight, I told Exxon that the girl would recover if she didn't tear off her bandages, which, while true enough, gave him the idea that she had been trying to tear them off, and from that he built up a plan of tearing them off himself, knowing that she had been given an opiate perhaps, and thinking that everybody would believe she had torn them off herself. And he was putting that plan in execution, had torn off one piece of tape when I stopped him. He shot her intentionally, and that's flat. Maybe I couldn't prove it in court without knowing why, but I know he did. But the doc says he'll hardly live to be tried. He killed himself trying to kill the girl. Maybe you're right. And Galloway's mocking grin flashed at me. But you're a hell of a detective just the same. Why didn't you suspect me? I did, I grinned back, but not enough. Why not? You may be making a mistake, he drawled. You know my room is just across the hall from his, and I could have left my window, crept across the porch, fired at him, and then run back to my room on that first night. And on the second night, when you were here, you ought to know that I left Nürnberg in plenty of time to have come out here, parked my car down the road a bit, fired those 2 shots, crept around in the shadow of the house, ran back to my car, and then come driving innocently up to the garage. You should know also that my reputation isn't any too good, that I'm supposed to be a bad egg, and you do know that I don't like the old man. And for a motive, there is the fact that my wife is Exxon's only heir. What more do you want? I hope, he raised his eyebrows in burlesqued pain, that you don't think I have any moral scruples against a well-placed murder now and then. I laughed. I don't. Well then, if Exxon had been killed that first night and I had come up here, you'd be doing your joking behind bars long before this. And if he'd been killed the second night even, I might have grabbed you. But I don't figure you as a man who'd bungle so easy a job. Not twice, anyway. You wouldn't have missed and then run away, leaving him alive." He reached over for my hand and shook it gravely. "It is comforting to have one's few virtues appreciated. Before Talbot Exxon died, he sent for me. He wanted to die, he said, with his curiosity appeased. And so we traded information. I told him how I had come to suspect him, just about what I had told his son-in-law, and he told me why he had tried to kill Barbara Kaywood. 14 years ago he had killed his wife, not for the insurance, as he had been suspected of doing, but in a fit of jealousy. However, he had so thoroughly covered up the proofs of his guilt that he had never been brought to trial. But the murder had weighed upon him, to the extent of becoming an obsession. He knew that he would never give himself away consciously. He was too shrewd for that. And he knew that proof of his guilt could never be found. But there was always the chance that sometime, in delirium, in his sleep, or when drunk, he might tell enough to bring him to the gallows. He thought upon this angle too often, until it became a morbid fear that always hounded him. He had given up drinking, that was easy, but there was no way of guarding against the other things. And one of them, he said, had finally happened. He had got pneumonia, and for a week he had been out of his head, and he had talked. Coming out of that week's delirium, he had questioned the nurse. She had given him vague answers, would not tell him what he had talked about, what he had said. And then, in unguarded moments, he had discovered that her eyes rested upon him with loathing, with intense repulsion. He knew then that he had babbled of his wife's murder, and he set about laying plans for removing the nurse before she repeated what she had heard. For so long as she remained in his house, he counted himself safe. She would not tell strangers, and it might be that for a while she would not tell anyone. Professional ethics would keep her quiet, perhaps, but he could not let her leave his house with her knowledge of his secret. Daily, and in secret, he had tested his strength until he knew himself strong enough to walk about the room a little and to hold a revolver steady. His bed was fortunately placed for his purpose, directly in line with one of the windows, the connecting door, and the girl's bed, in an old bond box in his closet. And nobody but he had ever seen the things in that box. Was a revolver that could not possibly be traced to him. On the first night, he had taken this gun out, stepped back from his bed a little, and fired a bullet into the doorframe. Then he had jumped back into bed, concealing the gun under the blankets, where none thought to look for it, until he could return it to its box. That was all the preparation he had needed. He had established an attempted murder directed against himself, and he had shown that a bullet fired at him could easily go near, and therefore through, the connecting doorway. On the second night, he had waited until the house had seemed quiet. Then he had peeped through one of the cracks in the Japanese screen at the girl, whom he could see in the reflected light from the moon. He had found, though, that when he stepped far enough back from the screen for it to escape powder marks, he could not see the girl, not while she was lying down. So he had fired first into the doorframe, near the previous night's bullet, to awaken her. She had sat up in bed immediately, screaming, and he had shot her. He had intended firing another shot into her body to make sure of her death, but my approach had made that impossible, and had made concealment of the gun impossible. So, with what strength he had left, he had thrown the revolver out of the window. He died that afternoon, and I returned to San Francisco. But that was not quite the end of the story. In the ordinary course of business, The agency's bookkeeping department sent Galloway a bill for my services. With the check that he sent by return mail, he enclosed a letter to me, from which I quote a paragraph. I don't want to let you miss the cream of the whole affair. The lovely Kaywood, when she recovered, denied that Exxon had talked of murder or any other crime during his delirium. The cause of the distaste with which she might have looked at him afterward, and the reason she would not tell him what he had said, was that his entire conversation during that week of delirium had consisted of an uninterrupted stream of obscenities and blasphemies which seemed to have shocked the girl through and through. Zigzags of Treachery by Dashiell Hammett. Here is a detective story which we think will please all comers. It is a happy combination of deduction and swift action. 1. All I know about Dr. Estep's death, I said, is the stuff in the papers. Vance Richmond's lean gray face took on an expression of distaste. The newspapers aren't always either thorough or accurate. I'll give you the salient points as I know them, though I suppose you'll want to go over the ground for yourself and get your information firsthand. I nodded, and the attorney went on, shaping each word precisely with his thin lips before giving it sound. Dr. Estep came to San Francisco in 98 or 99, a young man of 25, just through qualifying for his license. He opened an office here, and as you probably know, became in time a rather excellent surgeon. He married 2 or 3 years after he came here. There were no children. He and his wife seem to have been a bit happier together than the average. Of his life before coming to San Francisco, nothing is known. He told his wife briefly that he had been born and raised in Parkersburg, West Virginia, but that his home life had been so unpleasant that he was trying to forget it, and that he did not like to talk or even think about it. Bear that in mind. 2 weeks ago, on the 3rd of the month, a woman came to his office in the afternoon. His office was in his residence on Pine Street. Lucy Coe, who was Dr. Estep's nurse and assistant, showed the woman into his office and then went back to her own desk in the reception room. She didn't hear anything the doctor said to the woman, but through the closed door she heard the woman's voice now and then, a high and anguished voice, apparently pleading. Most of the words were lost upon the nurse, but she heard one coherent sentence. "Please, please," she heard the woman cry, "don't turn me away." The woman was with Dr. Estep for about 15 minutes and left sobbing into a handkerchief. Dr. Estep said nothing about the caller, either to his nurse or to his wife, who didn't learn of it until after his death. The next day, toward evening, while the nurse was putting on her hat and coat preparatory to leaving for home, Dr. Estep came out of his office with his hat on and a letter in his hand. The nurse saw that his face was pale, white as my uniform, she says, and he walked with the care of one who takes pains to keep from staggering. She asked him if he was ill. "Oh, it's nothing," he told her. "I'll be all right in a very few minutes." Then he went on out. The nurse left the house just behind him and saw him drop the letter he had carried into the mailbox on the corner, after which he returned to the house. Mrs. Estep, coming downstairs 10 minutes later, it couldn't have been any later than that, heard, just as she reached the first floor, the sound of a shot from her husband's office. She rushed into it, meeting nobody. Her husband stood by his desk, swaying, with a hole in his right temple and a smoking revolver in his hand. Just as she reached him and put her arms around him, he fell across the desk, dead. Anybody else? Any of the servants, for instance, able to say that Mrs. Estep didn't go to the office until after the shot? I asked. The attorney shook his head sharply. No, damn it. That's where the rub comes in. His voice, after this one flare of feeling, resumed its level, incisive tone, and he went on with his tale. The next day's papers had accounts of Dr. Estep's death, and late that morning, the woman who had called upon him the day before his death came to the house. She is Dr. Estep's first wife, which is to say his legal wife. There seems to be no reason, not the slightest, for doubting it, as much as I'd like to. They were married in Philadelphia in '96. She has a certified copy of the marriage record. I had the matter investigated in Philadelphia, and it's a certain fact that Dr. Estep and this woman, Edna Fife was her maiden name, were really married. She says that Estep, after living with her in Philadelphia for 2 years, deserted her. That would have been in '98, or just before he came to San Francisco. She has sufficient proof of her identity, that she really is the Edna Fife who married him, and my agents in the East found positive proof that Estep had practiced for 2 years in Philadelphia. And here is another point. I told you that Estep had said he was born and raised in Parkersburg. I had inquiries made there, but found nothing to show that he had ever lived there, and found ample to show that he had never lived at the address he had given his wife. There is, then, nothing for us to believe except that his talk of an unhappy early life was a ruse to ward off embarrassing questions. Did you do anything toward finding out whether the doctor and his first wife had ever been divorced? I asked. I'm having that taken care of now, but I hardly expect to learn that they had. That would be too crude. To get on with my story, this woman, the first, Mrs. Estep, said that she had just recently learned her husband's whereabouts and had come to see him in an attempt to effect a reconciliation. When she called upon him the afternoon before his death, he asked for a little time to make up his mind what he should do. He promised to give her his decision in 2 days. My personal opinion, after talking to the woman several times, is that she had learned that he had accumulated some money, and that her interest was more in getting the money than in getting him, but that, of course, is neither here nor there. At first, the authorities accepted the natural explanation of the doctor's death, suicide. But after the first wife's appearance, the second wife, my client, was arrested and charged with murder. The police theory is that after his first wife's visit, Dr. Estep told his second wife the whole story, and that she, brooding over the knowledge that he had deceived her, that she was not his wife at all, finally worked herself up into a rage, went to the office after his nurse had left for the day, and shot him with the revolver that she knew he always kept in his desk. I don't know, of course, just what evidence the prosecution has, but from the newspapers I gather that the case against her will be built upon her fingerprints on the revolver with which he was killed, an upset inkwell on his desk, splashes of ink on the dress she wore, and an inky print of her hand on a torn newspaper on his desk. Unfortunately, but perfectly naturally, one of the first things she did was to take the revolver out of her husband's hand. That accounts for her prints on it. He fell, as I told you, just as she put her arms around him, and though her memory isn't very clear on this point, the probabilities are that he dragged her with him when he fell across the desk. That accounts for the upset inkwell, the torn paper, and the splashes of ink. But the prosecution will try to persuade the jury that those things all happened before the shooting, that they are proofs of a struggle. Not so bad, I gave my opinion. Or pretty damned bad, depending on how you look at it. And this is the worst time imaginable for a thing like this to come up. Within the past few months, there have been no less than 5 widely advertised murders of men by women who were supposed to have been betrayed or deceived or one thing or another. Not one of those 5 women was convicted. As a result, we have the press, the public, and even the pulpit howling for a stricter enforcement of justice. The newspapers are lined up against Mrs. Estep as strongly as their fear of libel suits will permit. The women's clubs are lined up against her. Everybody is clamoring for an example to be made of her. Then, as if all that isn't enough, the prosecuting attorney has lost his last 2 big cases, and he'll be out for blood this time. Election day isn't far off. The calm, even, precise voice was gone now. In its place was a passionate eloquence. "I don't know what you think," Richmond cried. "You're a detective. This is an old story to you. You're more or less callous, I suppose, and skeptical of innocence in general. But I know that Mrs. Estep didn't kill her husband. I don't say it because she's my client. I was Dr. Estep's attorney and his friend, and if I thought Mrs. Estep guilty, I'd do everything in my power to help convict her. But I know as well as I know anything that she didn't kill him, couldn't have killed him. She's innocent. But I know, too, that if I go into court with no defense beyond what I now have, she'll be convicted. There has been too much leniency shown feminine criminals, public sentiment says. The pendulum will swing the other way. Mrs. Estep, if convicted, will get the limit. I'm putting it up to you. Can you save her?" "Our best mark is the letter he mailed just before he died," I said, ignoring everything he said that didn't have to do with the facts of the case. It's good betting that when a man writes and mails a letter and then shoots himself, that the letter isn't altogether unconnected with the suicide. Did you ask the first wife about the letter?" "I did, and she denies having received one." "That wasn't right. If the doctor had been driven to suicide by her appearance, then according to all the rules there are, the letter should have been addressed to her. He might have written one to his second wife, but he would hardly have mailed it." "Would she have any reason for lying about it?" "Yes," the lawyer said slowly. "I think she would. His will leaves everything to the second wife. The first wife, being the only legal wife, will have no difficulty in breaking that will, of course. But if it is shown that the second wife had no knowledge of the first one's existence, that she really believed herself to be Dr. Estep's legal wife, then I think that she will receive at least a portion of the estate. I don't think any court would, under the circumstances, take everything away from her. But if she should be found guilty of murdering Dr. Estep, then no consideration will be shown her, and the first wife will get every penny." "Did he leave enough to make half of it, say, worth sending an innocent person to the gallows for?" "He left about $500,000, roughly. $250,000 isn't a mean inducement." "Do you think it would be enough for the first wife, from what you have seen of her?" "Candidly, I do. She didn't impress me as being a person of very many active scruples." "Where does this first wife live?" I asked. "She's staying at the Montgomery Hotel now. Her home is in Louisville, I believe. I don't think you will gain anything by talking to her, however. She has retained Somerset and Quill to represent her, a very reputable firm, by the way, and she'll refer you to them. They will tell you nothing. But if there's anything dishonest about her affairs, such as the concealing of Dr. Estep's letter. I'm confident that Somerset and Quill know nothing of it. Can I talk to the second Mrs. Estep, your client? Not at present, I'm afraid, though perhaps in a day or two. She is on the verge of collapse just now. She has always been delicate, and the shock of her husband's death, followed by her own arrest and imprisonment, has been too much for her. She's in the city jail, you know, held without bail. I've tried to have her transferred to the prisoner's ward of the city hospital even, but the authorities seem to think that her illness is simply a ruse. I'm worried about her. She's really in a critical condition. His voice was losing its calmness again, so I picked up my hat, said something about starting to work at once, and went out. I don't like eloquence. If it isn't effective enough to pierce your hide, it's tiresome. And if it is effective enough, then it muddles your thoughts. 2. I spent the next couple of hours questioning the Estep servants, to no great advantage. None of them had been near the front of the house at the time of the shooting, and none had seen Mrs. Estep immediately prior to her husband's death. After a lot of hunting, I located Lucy Coe, the nurse, in an apartment on Vallejo Street. She was a small, brisk, businesslike woman of 30 or so. She repeated what Vance Richmond had told me, and could add nothing to it. That cleaned up the Estep end of the job, and I set out for the Montgomery Hotel, satisfied that my only hope for success, barring miracles, which usually don't happen, lay in finding the letter that I believed Dr. Estep had written to his first wife. My drag with the Montgomery Hotel management was pretty strong enough to get me anything I wanted that wasn't too far outside the law. So, as soon as I got there, I hunted up Stacy, one of the assistant managers. "This Mrs. Estep who's registered here," I asked. "What do you know about her?" "Nothing myself, but if you'll wait a few minutes, I'll see what I can learn." The assistant manager was gone about 10 minutes. "No one seems to know much about her," he told me when he came back. "I've questioned the telephone girls, bellboys, maids, clerks, and the house detective, but none of them could tell me much. She registered from Louisville on the 2nd of the month. She has never stopped here before, and she seems unfamiliar with the city. Asks quite a few questions about how to get around. The mail clerks don't remember handling any mail for her, nor do the girls on the switchboard have any record of phone calls for her. She keeps regular hours, usually goes out at 10 or later in the morning, and gets in before midnight. She doesn't seem to have any callers or friends. Will you have her mail watched? Let me know what postmarks and return addresses are on any letters she gets." "Certainly. And have the girls on the switchboard put their ears up against any talking she does over the wire?" "Yes." "Is she in her room now?" "No, she went out a little while ago." "Fine. I'd like to go up and take a look at her stuff." Stacy looked sharply at me and cleared his throat. "Is it as, important as all that? I want to give you all the assistance I can, but it's this important," I assured him, "that another woman's life depends on what I can learn about this one." "All right," he said. "I'll tell the clerk to let us know if she comes in before we are through, and we'll go right up." The woman's room held 2 valises and a trunk, all unlocked, and containing not the least thing of importance. No letters, nothing. So little, in fact, that I was more than half convinced that she had expected her things to be searched. Downstairs again, I planted myself in a comfortable chair within sight of the key rack and waited for a view of this first Mrs. Estep. She came in at 11:15 that night, A large woman of 45 or 50, well-dressed, and carrying herself with an air of assurance. Her face was a little too hard as to mouth and chin, but not enough to be ugly. A capable-looking woman, a woman who would get what she went after. 3. 8 o'clock was striking as I went into the Montgomery lobby the next morning and picked out a chair, this time within eye range of the elevators. At 10:30, Mrs. Estep left the hotel, with me in her wake. Her denial that a letter from her husband, written immediately before his death, had come to her didn't fit in with the possibilities as I saw them. And a good motto for the detective business is, when in doubt, shadow 'em. After eating breakfast at a restaurant on O'Farrell Street, she turned toward the shopping district, and for a long, long time, though I suppose it was a lot shorter than it seemed to me, she led me through the most densely packed portions of the most crowded department stores she could find. She didn't buy anything, but she did a lot of thorough looking, with me muddling along behind her, trying to act like a little fat guy on an errand for his wife, while stout women bumped me and thin ones prodded me and all sorts got in my way and walked on my feet. Finally, after I had sweated off a couple of pounds, she left the shopping district and cut up through Union Square, walking along casually, as if out for a stroll. 3/4 way through, she turned abruptly and retraced her steps, looking sharply at everyone she passed. I was on a bench, reading a stray page from a day-old newspaper when she went by. She walked on down Post Street to Kearny, stopping every now and then to look, or pretend to look, in store windows, while I ambled along, sometimes beside her, sometimes almost by her side, and sometimes in front. She was trying to check up the people around her, trying to determine whether she was being followed or not. But here, in the busy part of town, that gave me no cause for worry. On a less crowded street it might have been different, though not necessarily so. There are 4 rules for shadowing. Keep behind your subject as much as possible. Never try to hide from him. Act in a natural manner no matter what happens. And never meet his eye. Obey them, and except in unusual circumstances, shadowing is the easiest thing that a sleuth has to do. Assured after a while that no one was following her, Mrs. Estep turned back toward Powell Street and got into a taxicab at the St. Francis stand. I picked out a modest touring car from the rack of hire cars along the Gary Street side of Union Square and set out after her. Our route was out Post Street to Laguna, where the taxi presently swung into the curb and stopped. The woman got out, paid the driver, and went up the steps of an apartment building. With engine idling, my own car had come to rest against the opposite curb in the block above. As the taxicab disappeared around a corner, Mrs. Estep came out of the apartment building doorway, went back to the sidewalk, and started down Laguna Street. "Pass her," I told my chauffeur, and we drew down upon her. As we came abreast, she went up the front steps of another building, and this time she rang a bell. These steps belonged to a building apparently occupied by 4 flats, each with its separate door, and the button she had pressed belonged to the right-hand, second-story flat. Under cover of my car's rear curtains, I kept my eye on the doorway, while my driver found a convenient place to park in the next block. I kept my eye on the vestibule until 5:35 p.m., when she came out, walked to the Sutter Street car line, returned to the Montgomery, and went to her room. I called up the old man, the Continental Detective Agency's San Francisco manager, and asked him to detail an operative to learn who and what were the occupants of the Laguna Street flat. That night, Mrs. Estep ate dinner at her hotel and went to a show afterward, and she displayed no interest in possible shadowers. She went to her room at a little after 11, and I knocked off for the day. 4. The following morning, I turned the woman over to Dick Foley and went back to the agency to wait for Bob Teal, the operative who had investigated the Laguna Street flat. He came in at a little after 10. "A guy named Jacob Ledwidge lives there," Bob said. "He's a crook of some sort, but I don't know just what. He and Wav Healy are friendly, so he must be a crook. Porky Grout says he's an ex-bunco man who is in with a gambling ring now, but Porky would tell you a bishop was a safe ripper if he thought it would mean $5 for himself." Footnote: safe ripper, one who breaks into safes. End of footnote. This Ledwidge goes out mostly at night, and he seems to be pretty prosperous, probably a high-class worker of some sort. He's got a Buick, license number 645221, that he keeps in a garage around the corner from his flat, but he doesn't seem to use the car much. What sort of looking fellow is he? A big guy, 6 feet or better, and he'll weigh a couple hundred easy. He's got a funny mug on him. It's broad and heavy around the cheeks and jaw, but his mouth is a little one that looks like it was made for a smaller man. He's no youngster, middle-aged. Suppose you tail him around for a day or two, Bob, and see what he's up to. Try to get a room or apartment in the neighborhood, a place that you can cover his front door from. 5. Vance Richmond's lean face lighted up as soon as I mentioned Ledwidge's name to him. "Yes," he exclaimed. "He was a friend, or at least an acquaintance, of Dr. Estep's. I met him once. A large man with a peculiarly inadequate mouth. I dropped in to see the doctor one day, and Ledwidge was in the office. Dr. Estep introduced us." "What do you know about him?" "Nothing." "Don't you know whether he was intimate with the doctor, or just a casual acquaintance?" "No. For all I know, he might have been a friend, a patient, or almost anything. The doctor never spoke of him to me, and nothing passed between them while I was there that afternoon. I simply gave the doctor some information he had asked for and left." "Why?" "Dr. Estep's first wife, after going to a lot of trouble to see that she wasn't followed, connected with Ledwidge yesterday afternoon, and from what we can learn, he seems to be a crook of some sort." "What would that indicate?" "I'm not sure what it means, but I can do a lot of guessing. Ledwidge knew both the doctor and the doctor's first wife. Then it's not a bad bet that she knew where her husband was all the time. If she did, then it's another good bet that she was getting money from him right along. Can you check up his accounts and see whether he was passing out any money that can't be otherwise accounted for?" The attorney shook his head. "No, his accounts are in rather bad shape, carelessly kept. He must have had more than a little difficulty with his income tax statements." "I see. To get back to my guesses, if she knew where he was all the time and was getting money from him, then why did his first wife finally come to see her husband? Perhaps because—" "I think I can help you there," Richmond interrupted. "A fortunate investment in lumber nearly doubled Dr. Estep's wealth 2 or 3 months ago." "That's it, then. She learned of it through Ledwidge. She demanded, either through Ledwidge or by letter, a rather large share of it. More than the doctor was willing to give. When he refused, she came to see him in person, to demand the money under threat, we'll say, of instant exposure. He thought she was in earnest. Either he couldn't raise the money she demanded, or he was tired of leading a double life. Anyway, he thought it all over and decided to commit suicide. This is all a guess, or a series of guesses, but it sounds reasonable to me." "To me, too," the attorney said. "What are you going to do now?" I'm still having both of them shadowed. There's no other way of tackling them just now. I'm having the woman looked up in Louisville. But, you understand, I might dig up a whole flock of things on them, and when I got through, still be as far as ever from finding the letter Dr. Estep wrote before he died. There are plenty of reasons for thinking that the woman destroyed the letter. That would have been her wisest play. But if I can get enough on her, even at that, I can squeeze her into admitting that the letter was written, and that it said something about suicide, if it did. And that will be enough to spring your client. How is she today? Any better? His thin face lost the animation that had come to it during our discussion of Ledwidge, and became bleak. She went completely to pieces last night and was removed to the hospital, where she should have been taken in the first place. To tell you the truth, if she isn't liberated soon, she won't need our help. I've done my utmost to have her released on bail, pulled every wire I know, but there's little likelihood of success in that direction. Knowing that she is a prisoner, charged with murdering her husband, is killing her. She isn't young, and she has always been subject to nervous disorders. The bare shock of her husband's death was enough to prostrate her, but now, you've got to get her out, and quickly. He was striding up and down his office, his voice throbbing with feeling. I left quickly. 6. From the attorney's office, I returned to the agency, where I was told that Bob Teal had phoned in the address of a furnished apartment he had rented on Laguna Street. I hopped on a streetcar and went up to take a look at it. But I didn't get that far. Walking down Laguna Street, after leaving the car, I spied Bob Teal coming toward me. Between Bob and me, also coming toward me, was a big man, whom I recognized as Jacob Ledwidge, a big man with a big red face around a tiny mouth. I walked on down the street, passing both Ledwidge and Bob, without paying any apparent attention to either. At the next corner, I stopped to roll a cigarette and steal a look at the pair. And then I came to life. Ledwidge had stopped at a vestibule cigar stand up the street to make a purchase. Bob Teal, knowing his stuff, had passed him and was walking steadily up the street. He was figuring that Ledwidge had either come out for the purpose of buying cigars or cigarettes and would return to his flat with them, or that after making his purchase, the big man would proceed to the car line, where, in either event, Bob would wait. But as Ledwidge had stopped before the cigar stand, a man across the street had stepped suddenly into a doorway and stood there, back in the shadows. This man, I now remembered, had been on the opposite side of the street from Bob and Ledwidge, and walking in the same direction. He, too, was following Ledwidge. By the time Ledwidge had finished his business at the stand, Bob had reached Sutter Street, the nearest car line. Ledwidge started up the street in that direction. The man in the doorway stepped out and went after him. I followed that one. A ferry-bound car came down Sutter Street just as I reached the corner. Ledwidge and I got aboard together. The mysterious stranger fumbled with a shoestring several pavements from the corner until the car was moving again, and then he likewise made a dash for it. He stood beside me on the rear platform, hiding behind a large man in overalls, past whose shoulder he now and then peeped at Ledwidge. Bob had gone to the corner above, and was already seated when Ledwidge, this amateur detective, there was no doubting his amateur status, and I got on the car. I sized up the amateur while he strained his neck, peeping at Ledwidge. He was small, this sleuth, and scrawny and frail. His most noticeable feature was his nose, a limp organ that twitched nervously all the time. His clothes were old and shabby, and he himself was somewhere in his 50s. After studying him for a few minutes, I decided that he hadn't tumbled to Bob Teal's part in the game. His attention had been too firmly fixed upon Ledwidge, and the distance had been too short thus far for him to discover that Bob was also tailing the big man. So, when the seat beside Bob was vacated presently, I chucked my cigarette away, went into the car, and sat down, my back toward the little man with the twitching nose. Drop off after a couple of blocks and go back to the apartment. Don't shadow Ledwidge any more until I tell you. Just watch his place. There's a bird following him, and I want to see what he's up to. I told Bob, in an undertone. He grunted that he understood, and after a few minutes, left the car. At Stockton Street, Ledwidge got off, the man with the twitching nose behind him, and me in the rear. In that formation, we paraded around town all afternoon. The big man had business in a number of pool rooms, cigar stores, and soft drink parlors, most of which I knew for places where you can get a bet down on any horse that's running in North America, whether at Tanforan, Tijuana, or Timonium. Just what Ledwidge did in these places I didn't learn. I was bringing up the rear of the procession, and my interest was centered upon the mysterious little stranger. He didn't enter any of the places behind Ledwidge, but loitered in the neighborhoods until Ledwidge reappeared. He had a rather strenuous time of it, laboring mightily to keep out of Ledwidge's sight, and only succeeding because we were downtown, where you can get away with almost any sort of shadowing. He certainly made a lot of work for himself, dodging here and there. After a while, Ledwidge shook him. The big man came out of a cigar store with another man. They got into an automobile that was standing beside the curb and drove away, leaving my man standing on the edge of the sidewalk, twitching his nose in chagrin. There was a taxi stand just around the corner, but he either didn't know it or didn't have enough money to pay the fare. I expected him to return to Laguna Street then, but he didn't. He led me down Kearny Street to Portsmouth Street, where he stretched himself out on the grass, face down, lit a black pipe, and lay looking dejectedly at the Stevenson Monument, probably without seeing it. I sprawled on a comfortable piece of sod some distance away, between a Chinese woman with two perfectly round children and an ancient Portuguese in a gaily checkered suit, and we let the afternoon go by. When the sun had gone low enough for the ground to become chilly, the little man got up, shook himself, and went back up Kearny Street to a cheap lunchroom, where he ate meagerly. Then he entered a hotel a few doors away, took a key from the row of hooks, and vanished down a dark corridor. Running through the register, I found that the key he had taken belonged to a room whose occupant was John Boyd, St. Louis, Missouri, and that he had arrived the day before. This hotel wasn't of the sort where it is safe to make inquiries, so I went down to the street again and came to rest on the least conspicuous nearby corner. Twilight came, and the street and shop lights were turned on. It got dark. The night traffic of Kearny Street went up and down past me. Filipino boys in their too dapper clothes, bound for the inevitable blackjack game. Gaudy women, still heavy-eyed from their day's sleep. Plainclothes men on their way to headquarters to report before going off duty. Chinese going to or from Chinatown. Sailors in pairs, looking for action of any sort. Hungry people making for the Italian and French restaurants. Worried people going into the bail bond broker's office on the corner to arrange for the release of friends and relatives whom the police had nabbed. Italians on their homeward journeys from work. Odds and ends of furtive-looking citizens on various shady errands. Midnight came, and no John Boyd, and I called it a day and went home. Before going to bed, I talked with Dick Foley over the wire, He said that Mrs. Estep had done nothing of any importance all day and had received neither mail nor phone calls. I told him to stop shadowing her until I solved John Boyd's game. I was afraid Boyd might turn his attention to the woman, and I didn't want him to discover that she was being shadowed. I had already instructed Bob Teal to simply watch Ledwidge's flat, to see when he came in and went out, and with whom. And now I told Dick to do the same with the woman. My guess on this Boyd person was that he and the woman were working together, that she had him watching Ledwidge for her, so that the big man couldn't double-cross her. But that was only a guess, and I don't gamble too much on my guesses. 7. The next morning I dressed myself up in an army shirt and shoes, an old faded cap, and a suit that wasn't downright ragged, but was shabby enough not to stand out too noticeably beside John Boyd's old clothes. It was a little after 9 o'clock when Boyd left his hotel and had breakfast at the grease joint where he had eaten the night before. Then he went up to Laguna Street, picked himself a corner, and waited for Jacob Ledwidge. He did a lot of waiting. He waited all day, because Ledwidge didn't show until after dark. But the little man was well stocked with patience, I'll say that for him. He fidgeted, and stood on one foot and then the other, and even tried sitting on the curb for a while. But he stuck it out. I took it easy myself. The furnished apartment Bob Teal had rented to watch Ledwidge's flat from was a ground-floor one, across the street, and just a little above the corner where Boyd waited. So we could watch him and the flat with one eye. Bob and I sat and smoked and talked all day, taking turns watching the fidgeting man on the corner and Ledwidge's door. Night had just definitely settled when Ledwidge came out and started up toward the car line. I slid out into the street, and our parade was underway again, Ledwidge leading, Boyd following him, and we following him. Half a block of this, and I got an idea. I'm not what you'd call a brilliant thinker. Such results as I get are usually the fruits of patience, industry, and unimaginative plugging, helped out now and then, maybe, by a little luck, but I do have my flashes of intelligence, and this was one of them. Ledwidge was about a block ahead of me, Boyd half that distance. Speeding up, I passed Boyd and caught up with Ledwidge. Then I slackened my pace so as to walk beside him, though with no appearance from the rear of having any interest in him. "Jake," I said, without turning my head, "there's a guy following you." The big man almost spoiled my little scheme by stopping dead still, but he caught himself in time, and, taking his cue from me, kept walking. "Who the hell are you?" he growled. "Don't get funny," I snapped back, still looking and walking ahead. "It ain't my funeral, but I was coming up the street when you came out, and I seen this guy duck behind a pole until you was past, and then follow you up." That got him. "You sure?" "Sure. All you got to do to prove it is turn the next corner and wait." I was 2 or 3 steps ahead of him by this time. I turned the corner and halted, with my back against the brick building front. Ledwidge took up the same position at my side. "Want any help?" I grinned at him, a reckless sort of grin, unless my acting was poor. "No." His little lumpy mouth was set ugly, and his blue eyes were hard as pebbles. I flicked the tail of my coat aside to show him the butt of my gun. "Want to borrow the rod?" I asked. "No." He was trying to figure me out, and small wonder. "Don't mind if I stick around to see the fun, do you?" I asked, mockingly. There wasn't time for him to answer that. Boyd had quickened his steps, and now he came hurrying around the corner, his nose twitching like a tracking dog's. Ledwidge stepped into the middle of the sidewalk, so suddenly that the little man thudded into him with a grunt. For a moment, they stared at each other, and there was recognition between them. Ledwidge shot one big hand out and clamped the other by a shoulder. "What are you snooping around me for, you rat? Didn't I tell you to keep away from Frisco?" "Oh, Jake," Boyd begged, "I didn't mean no harm. I just thought that—" Ledwidge silenced him with a shake that clicked his mouth shut and turned to me. "A friend of mine," he sneered. His eyes grew suspicious and hard again, and ran up and down me from cap to shoes. "How'd you know my name?" he demanded. "A famous man like you?" I asked, in burlesque astonishment. "Never mind the comedy." He took a threatening step toward me. "How'd you know my name?" "None of your damned business," I snapped. My attitude seemed to reassure him. His face became less suspicious. "Well," he said slowly, "I owe you something for this trek, and—" "How are you fixed?" "I have been dirtier." Dirty is Pacific Coast argot for prosperous. He looked speculatively from me to Boyd and back. "Know the circle?" he asked me. I nodded. "The underworld calls Wap Healy's joint the Circle. If you'll meet me there tomorrow night, maybe I can put a piece of change your way." "Nothing stirring." I shook my head with emphasis. "I ain't circulating that prominent these days." A fat chance I'd have of meeting him there. Wap Healy and half his customers knew me as a detective, so there was nothing to do but to try to get the impression over that I was a crook who had reasons for wanting to keep away from the more notorious hangouts for a while. Apparently it got over. He thought a while, and then gave me his Laguna Street number. "Drop in this time tomorrow, and maybe I'll have a proposition to make you, if you've got the guts." "I'll think it over," I said non-committally, and turned as if to go down the street. "Just a minute," he called, and I faced him again. "What's your name?" "Wisher," I said. "Shine, if you want a front one." "Shine Wisher," he repeated. "I don't remember ever hearing it before." It would have surprised me if he had. I had made it up only about 15 minutes before. "You needn't yell it," I said sourly, "so that everybody in the burg will remember hearing it." And with that I left him, not at all dissatisfied with myself. By tipping him off to Boyd, I had put him under obligations to me, and it led him to accept me, at least tentatively, as a fellow crook, and by making no apparent effort to gain his good graces, I had strengthened my hand that much more. I had a date with him for the next day, when I was to be given a chance to earn, illegally no doubt, a piece of change. There was a chance that this proposition he had in view for me had nothing to do with the Estep affair, but then again it might, and whether it did or not, I had my entering wedge at least a little way into Jake Ledwidge's business. I strolled around for about half an hour, and then went back to Bob Teal's apartment. "Ledwidge come back?" "Yes," Bob said, "with that little guy of yours. They went in about half an hour ago." "Good. Haven't seen a woman go in?" "No." I expected to see the first Mrs. Estep arrive sometime during the evening, but she didn't. Bob and I sat around and talked and watched Ledwidge's doorway, and the hours passed. At 1 o'clock, Ledwidge came out alone. "I'm going to tail him, just for luck," Bob said, and caught up his cap. Ledwidge vanished around a corner, and then Bob passed out of sight behind him. 5 minutes later, Bob was with me again. "He's getting his machine out of the garage." I jumped for the telephone and put in a rush order for a fast touring car. Bob, at the window, called out, "Here he is." I joined Bob in time to see Ledwidge going into his vestibule. His car stood in front of the house. A very few minutes, and Boyd and Ledwidge came out together. Boyd was leaning heavily on Ledwidge, who was supporting the little man with an arm across his back. We couldn't see their faces in the dark, but the little man was plainly either sick, drunk, or drugged. Ledwidge helped his companion into the touring car. The red taillights laughed back at us for a few blocks and then disappeared. The automobile I had ordered arrived 20 minutes later, so we sent it back unused. At a little after 3 that morning, Ledwidge, alone and afoot, returned from the direction of his garage. He had been gone exactly 2 hours. 8. Neither Bob nor I went home that night, but slept in the Laguna Street apartment. Bob went down to the corner grocer's to get what we needed for breakfast in the morning, and brought a morning paper back with him. I cooked breakfast, while he divided his attention between Ledwidge's front door and the newspaper. "Hey," he called suddenly, "look here." I ran out of the kitchen with a handful of bacon. "What is it?" "Listen. Park murder mystery," he read. "Early this morning, the body of an unidentified man was found near a driveway in Golden Gate Park. His neck had been broken, according to the police, who say that the absence of any considerable bruises on the body, as well as the orderly condition of the clothes and the ground nearby, show that he did not come to his death through falling or being struck by an automobile. It is believed that he was killed and then carried to the park in an automobile to be left there." "Boyd," I said. "I bet you." Bob agreed. And at the morgue a very little while later, we learned that we were correct. The dead man was John Boyd. "He was dead when Ledwidge brought him out of the house," Bob said. I nodded. He was. He was a little man, and it wouldn't have been much of a stunt for a big bruiser like Ledwidge to have dragged him along with one arm the short distance from the door to the curb, pretending to be holding him up like you do with a drunk. Let's go over to the Hall of Justice and see what the police have got on it, if anything. At the Detective Bureau, we hunted up O'Gara, the detective sergeant in charge of the homicide detail, and a good man to work with. "This dead man found in the park?" I asked. "Know anything about him?" O'Gara pushed back his village constable's hat, a big black hat with a floppy brim that belongs in vaudeville, scratched his bullet head, and scowled at me as if he thought I had a joke up my sleeve. "Not a damned thing, except that he's dead," he said at last. "How'd you like to know who he was last seen with? It wouldn't hinder me any in finding out who bumped him off, and that's a fact." "How do you like the sound of this?" I asked. "His name was John Boyd, and he was living at a hotel down in the next block. The last person he was seen with was a guy who is tied up with Dr. Estep's first wife. You know, the Dr. Estep, whose second wife is the woman you people are trying to prove a murder on. Does that sound interesting?" "It does," he said. "Where do we go first?" "This Ledwidge. He's the fellow who was last seen with Boyd. Is going to be a hard bird to shake down. We better try to crack the woman first. The first, Mrs. Estep. There's a chance that Boyd was a pal of hers, and in that case, when she finds out that Ledwidge rubbed him out, she may open up and spill the works to us. On the other hand, if she and Ledwidge are stacked up against Boyd together, then we might as well get her safely placed before we tie into him. I don't want to pull him before night anyway. I got a date with him, and I want to try to rope him first." Bob Teal made for the door. "I'm going up and keep my eye on him until you're ready for him," he called over his shoulder. "Good," I said. "Don't let him get out of town on us. If he tries to blow, have him chucked in the can." In the lobby of the Montgomery Hotel, Ogar and I talked to Dick Foley first. He told us that the woman was still in her room, had had her breakfast sent up. She had received neither letters, telegrams, or phone calls since we began to watch her. I got hold of Stacy again. We're going up to talk to this Estep woman, and maybe we'll take her away with us. Will you send up a maid to find out whether she's up and dressed yet? We don't want to announce ourselves ahead of time, and we don't want to burst in on her while she's in bed or only partly dressed. He kept us waiting about 15 minutes, and then told us that Mrs. Estep was up and dressed. We went up to her room, taking the maid with us. The maid rapped on the door. "What is it?" an irritable voice demanded. "The maid, I want to—" The key turned on the inside, and an angry Mrs. Estep jerked the door open. Ogar and I advanced, Ogar flashing his buzzer. Footnote, badge. End of footnote. "From headquarters," he said. "We want to talk to you." Ogar's foot was where she couldn't slam the door on us, and we were both walking ahead, so there was nothing for her to do but to retreat into the room, admitting us, which she did, with no pretense of graciousness. We closed the door, and then I threw our big load at her. "Mrs. Estep, why did Jake Ledwich kill John Boyd?" The expressions ran over her face like this: alarm at Ledwich's name, fear at the word kill, but the name John Boyd brought only bewilderment. "Why did what?" she stammered meaninglessly to gain time. "Exactly," I said. "Why did Jake kill him last night in his flat and then take him in the park and leave him?" Another set of expressions, increased bewilderment until I had almost finished the sentence, and then the sudden understanding of something, followed by the inevitable groping for poise. These things weren't as plain as billboards, you understand, but they were there to be read by anyone who had ever played poker, either with cards or people. What I got out of them was that Boyd hadn't been working with or for her, and that, though she knew Ledwich had killed somebody at some time, it wasn't Boyd, and it wasn't last night. Who then? And when? Dr. Estep? Hardly. There wasn't a chance in the world that, if he had been murdered, anybody except his wife had done it. His second wife. No possible reading of the evidence could bring any other answer. Who then had Ledwich killed before Boyd? Was he a wholesale murderer? These things are flitting through my head in flashes and odd scraps, while Mrs. Estep is saying, "This is absurd. The idea of your coming up here and—" She talked for 5 minutes straight, the words fairly sizzling from between her hard lips, but the words themselves didn't mean anything. She was talking for time, talking while she tried to hit upon the safest attitude to assume. And before we could head her off, she had hit upon it. Silence. We got not another word out of her, and that is the only way in the world to beat the grilling game. The average suspect tries to talk himself out of being arrested, and it doesn't matter how shrewd a man is or how good a liar. If he'll talk to you and you play your cards right, you can hook him, can make him help you convict him. But if he won't talk, you can't do a thing with him. And that's how it was with this woman. She refused to pay attention to our questions. She wouldn't speak, nod, grunt, or wave an arm in reply. She gave us a fine assortment of facial expressions, true enough, but we wanted verbal information, and we got none. We weren't easily licked, however. 3 beautiful hours of it we gave her without rest. We stormed, cajoled, threatened, and at times I think we danced, but it was no go. So in the end we took her away with us. We didn't have anything on her, but we couldn't afford to have her running around loose until we nailed Ledwich. At the Hall of Justice, we didn't book her, but simply held her as a material witness, putting her in an office with a matron and one of O'Gara's men, who were to see what they could do with her while we went after Ledwich. We had her frisked as soon as she reached the hall, of course, and as we expected, she hadn't a thing of importance on her. O'Gara and I went back to the Montgomery and gave her room a thorough overhauling, and found nothing. "Are you sure you know what you're talking about?" the detective sergeant asked as we left the hotel. "It's going to be a pretty joke on somebody if you're mistaken." I let that go by without an answer. "I'll meet you at 6:30, I said, "and we'll go up against Ledwich." He grunted unapproval, and I set out for Vance Richmond's office. 9. The attorney sprang up from his desk as soon as his stenographer had admitted me. His face was leaner and grayer than ever. Its lines had deepened, and there was a hollowness around his eyes. "You've got to do something," he cried huskily. "I've just come from the hospital. Mrs. Estep is on the point of death. A day more of this, 2 days at the most, and she will—" I interrupted him, and swiftly gave him an account of the day's happenings, and what I expected, or hoped, to make out of them. But he received the news without brightening, and shook his head hopelessly. "But don't you see," he exclaimed when I had finished, that won't do? I know you can find proof of her innocence in time. I'm not complaining. You've done all that could be expected, and more. But all that's no good. I've got to have, well, a miracle, perhaps. Suppose that you do finally get the truth out of Ledwich and the first Mrs. Estep, or it comes out during their trials for Boyd's murder, or that you even get to the bottom of the matter in 3 or 4 days. That will be too late. If I can go to Mrs. Estep and tell her she's free now, she may pull herself together and come through. But another day of imprisonment, 2 days, or perhaps even 2 hours, and she won't need anybody to clear her. Death will have done it. I tell you, she's—" I left Vance Richmond abruptly again. This lawyer was bound upon getting me worked up, and I like my jobs to be simply jobs. Emotions are nuisances during business hours. 10. At 6:45 that evening, while O'Gara remained down the street, I rang Jacob Ledwich's bell. As I had stayed with Bob Teal in our apartment the previous night, I was still wearing the clothes in which I had made Ledwich's acquaintance as Shine Wisher. Ledwich opened the door. "Hello, Wisher," he said without enthusiasm, and led me upstairs. His flat consisted of 4 rooms, I found, running the full length and half the breadth of the building, with both front and rear exits. It was furnished with the ordinary, none too spotless appointments of the typical moderately priced furnished flat, alike the world over. In his front room we sat down and talked and smoked and sized one another up. He seemed a little nervous. I thought he would have been just as well satisfied if I had forgotten to show up. "About this job you mentioned?" I asked presently. "Sorry," he said, moistening his little lumpy mouth, "but it's all off." Then he added, obviously as an afterthought, "for the present at least." I guessed from that my job was to have taken care of Boyd, but Boyd had been taken care of for good. He brought out some whiskey after a while, and we talked over it for some time, to no purpose whatever. He was trying not to appear too anxious to get rid of me, and I was cautiously feeling him out. Piecing things together, he let fall here and there, I came to the conclusion that he was a former con man who had fallen into an easier game of late years. That was in line, too, with what Porky Grout had told Bob Teal. I talked about myself with the evasiveness that would have been natural to a crook in my situation, and made one or two carefully planned slips that would lead him to believe that I had been tied up with the Jimmy the Riveter holdup mob, most of whom were doing long hitches at Walla Walla then. He offered to lend me enough money to tide me over until I could get on my feet again. I told him I didn't need chicken feed so much as a chance to pick up some real jack. The evening was going along, and we were getting nowhere. "Jake," I said casually, outwardly casual, that is, "you took a big chance putting that guy out of the way like you did last night." I meant to stir things up, and I succeeded. His face went crazy. A gun came out of his coat, firing from my pocket. I shot it out of his hand. "Now behave," I ordered. He sat rubbing his benumbed hand and staring with wide eyes at the smoldering hole in my coat. Looks like a great stunt, this shooting a gun out of a man's hand. But it's the thing that happens now and then. A man who is a fair shot, and that is exactly what I am, no more, no less, naturally and automatically shoots pretty close to the spot upon which his eyes are focused. When a man goes for his gun in front of you, you shoot at him, not at any particular part of him. There isn't time for that. You shoot at him. However, you are more than likely to be looking at his gun. And in that case, it isn't altogether surprising if your bullet should hit his gun, as mine had done. But it looks impressive. I beat out the fire around the bullet hole in my coat, crossed the room to where his revolver had been knocked, and picked it up. I started to eject the bullets from it, but instead I snapped it shut again and stuck it in my pocket. Then I returned to my chair opposite him. "A man oughtn't to act like that," I kidded him. "He's likely to hurt somebody." His little mouth curled up at me. "An elbow, huh?" Putting all the contempt he could in his voice. And somehow, any synonym for detective seems able to hold a lot of contempt. I might have tried to talk myself back into the wisher role. It could have been done, but I doubted that it would be worth it, so I nodded my confession. His brain was working now, and the passion left his face, while he sat rubbing his right hand, and his little mouth and eyes began to screw themselves up calculatingly. I kept quiet, waiting to see what the outcome of his thinking would be. I knew he was trying to figure out just what my place in this game was, since, to his knowledge, I had come into it no later than the previous evening. Then the Boyd murder hadn't brought me in. That would leave the Estep affair, unless he was tied up in a lot of other crooked stuff that I didn't know anything about. "You're not a city dick, are you?" he asked finally, and his voice was on the verge of friendliness now, the voice of one who wants to persuade you of something, or sell you something. The truth, I thought, wouldn't hurt. "No," I said, "I'm with the Continental." He hitched his chair a little closer to the muzzle of my automatic. "What are you after, then? Where do you come in on it?" I tried the truth again. "The second Mrs. Estep. She didn't kill her husband. You're trying to dig up enough dope to spring her?" "Yes." I waved him back as he tried to hitch his chair still nearer. "How do you expect to do it?" he asked, his voice going lower and more confidential with each word. I took still another flyer at the truth. "He wrote a letter before he died." "Well?" But I called a halt for the time. Just that. I said. He leaned back in his chair, and his eyes and mouth grew small in thought again. "What's your interest in the man who died last night?" he asked slowly. "It's something on you," I said, truthfully again. "It doesn't do the second Mrs. Estep any direct good, maybe, but you and the first wife are stacked up together against her. Anything, therefore, that hurts you two will help her somehow. I admit I'm wandering around in the dark, but I'm going ahead wherever I see a point of light, and I'll come through to daylight in the end. Nailing you for Boyd's murder is one point of light." He leaned forward suddenly, his eyes and mouth popping open as far as they would go. "You'll come out all right," he said very softly, "if you use a little judgment." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Do you think," he asked, still very softly, "that you can nail me for Bird's murder? That you can convict me of murder?" "I do." But I wasn't any too sure. In the first place, though we were morally certain of it, neither Bob Teal nor I could swear that the man who had got in the machine with Ledwich was John Boyd. We knew it was, of course, but the point is that it had been too dark for us to see his face. And again, in the dark, we had thought him alive. It wasn't until later that we knew he had been dead when he came down the steps. Little things, those, but a private detective on the witness stand, unless he is absolutely sure of every detail, has an unpleasant and ineffectual time of it. "I do," I repeated, thinking these things over, "and I'm satisfied to go to the bat with what I've got on you and what I can collect between now and the time you and your accomplice go to trial." "Accomplice?" he said, not very surprised. "That would be Edna. I suppose you've already grabbed her?" "Yes." He laughed. "You'll have one sweet time getting anything out of her. In the first place, she doesn't know much. And in the second, well, I suppose you've tried, and have found out what a helpful sort she is. So don't try the old gag of pretending that she has talked." "I'm not pretending anything." Silence between us for a few seconds, and then, "I'm going to make you a proposition," he said. "You can take it or leave it. The note Dr. Estep wrote before he died was to me, and it is positive proof that he committed suicide. Give me a chance to get away, just a chance, a half-hour start, and I'll give you my word of honor to send you the letter." "I know I can trust you," I said sarcastically. "I'll trust you then," he shot back at me. "I'll turn the note over to you if you'll give me your word that I'm to have half an hour's start." "For what?" I demanded. "Why shouldn't I take both you and the note? If you can get them? But do I look like the kind of sap who would leave the note where it would be found? Do you think it's here in the room, maybe?" I didn't, but neither did I think that because he had hidden it, it couldn't be found. "I can't think of any reason why I should bargain with you," I told him. "I've got you cold, and that's enough. If I can show you that your only chance of freeing the second Mrs. Estep is through my voluntary assistance, will you bargain with me?" "Maybe. I'll listen to your persuasion anyway." "All right," he said. "I'm going to come clean with you. But most of the things I'm going to tell you can't be proven in court without my help. And if you turn my offer down, I'll have plenty of evidence to convince the jury that these things are all false, that I never said them, and that you are trying to frame me." That part was plausible enough. I've testified before juries all the way from the city of Washington to the state of Washington, and I've never seen one yet that wasn't anxious to believe that a private detective is a double-crossing specialist who goes around with a cold deck in one pocket, a complete forger's outfit in another, and who counts that day lost in which he railroads no innocent to the hoosegow. 11. And there was once a young doctor in a town a long way from here, Ledwich began. He got mixed up in a scandal, a pretty rotten one, and escaped the pen only by the skin of his teeth. The state medical board revoked his license. In a large city, not far away, this young doc, one night when he was drunk, as he usually was in those days, told his troubles to a man he had met in a dive. The friend was a resourceful sort, and he offered for a price to fix the doc up with a fake diploma so he could set up in practice in some other state. The young doctor took him up, and the friend got the diploma for him. The doc was the man you know is Dr. Estep, and I was the friend. The real Dr. Estep was found dead in the park this morning. That was news, if true. You see, the big man went on, when I offered to get the phony diploma for the young doc, whose real name doesn't matter, I had in mind a forged one. Nowadays, they're easy to get. There's a regular business in them. But 25 years ago, while you could manage it, they were hard to get. While I was trying to get one, I ran across a woman I used to work with, Edna Fife. That's the woman you know as the first Mrs. Estep. Edna had married a doctor, the real Dr. Humbert Estep. He was a hell of a doctor, though, and after starving with him in Philadelphia for a couple of years, she made him close up his office, and she went back to the bunco game, taking him with her. Footnote: bunco game, swindle. End of footnote. She was good at it, I'm telling you, a real cleaner. And keeping him under her thumb all the time, she made him a pretty good worker himself. Footnote: cleaner, the one who takes all the money. End of footnote. It was shortly after that I met her, and when she told me all this, I offered to buy her husband's medical diploma and other credentials. I don't know whether he wanted to sell them or not, but he did what she told him, and I got the papers. I turned them over to the young doc, who came to San Francisco and opened an office under the name of Humbert Estep. The real Esteps promised not to use that name anymore, not much of an inconvenience for them, as they changed names every time they changed addresses. I kept in touch with the young doctor, of course, getting my regular rick-off from him. I had him by the neck, and I wasn't foolish enough to pass up any easy money. After a year or so, I learned that he had pulled himself together and was making good. So I jumped on a train and came to San Francisco. He was doing fine, so I camped here, where I could keep my eye on him and watch out for my own interests. He got married about then, and between his practice and his investments, he began to accumulate a roll. But he tightened up on me. Damn him, he wouldn't be bled. I got a regular percentage of what he made, and that was all. For nearly 25 years I got it, but not a nickel over the percentage. He knew I wouldn't kill the goose that laid the golden eggs, so no matter how much I threatened to expose him, he sat tight, and I couldn't budge him. I got my regular cut, and not a nickel more. That went along, as I say, for years. I was getting a living out of him, but I wasn't getting any big money. A few months ago I learned that he had cleaned up heavily in a lumber deal, so I made up my mind to take him for what he had. During all these years, I had got to know the doc pretty well. You do when you're bleeding a man. You get a pretty fair idea of what goes on in his head and what he's most likely to do if certain things happen. So I knew the doc pretty well. I knew, for instance, that he had never told his wife the truth about his past, that he had stalled her with some lie about being born in West Virginia. That was fine, for me. Then I knew that he kept a gun in his desk, and I knew why. It was kept there for the purpose of killing himself if the truth ever came out about his diploma. He figured that if, at the first hint of exposure, he wiped himself out, the authorities, out of respect for the good reputation he had built up, would hush things up. And his wife, even if she herself learned the truth, would be spared the shame of a public scandal. I can't see myself dying just to spare some woman's feeling, but the doc was a funny guy in some ways, and he was nutty about his wife. That's the way I had him figured out, and that's the way things turned out. My plan might sound complicated, but it was simple enough. I got a hold of the real Estops. It took a lot of hunting, but I found them at last. I brought the woman to San Francisco and told the man to stay away. Everything would have gone fine if he had done what I told him, but he was afraid that Edna and I were going to double-cross him, so he came here to keep an eye on us. But I didn't know that until you put the finger on him for me. I brought Edna here, and without telling her any more than she had to know, drilled her until she was letter-perfect in her part. A couple days before she came, I had gone to see the doc and had demanded 100,000 cool smacks. He laughed at me, and I left, pretending to be as hot as hell. As soon as Edna arrived, I sent her to call on him. She asked him to perform an illegal operation on her daughter. He, of course, refused. Then she pleaded with him, loud enough for the nurse or whoever else was in the reception room to hear. And when she raised her voice, she was careful to stick to words that could be interpreted the way we wanted them to. She ran off her end to perfection, leaving in tears. Then I sprung my other trick. I had a fellow who's a whiz at that kind of stuff, make me a plate, an imitation of newspaper printing. It was all worded like the real article, and said that the state authorities were investigating information that a prominent surgeon in San Francisco was practicing under a license secured by false credentials. This plate measured 408 by 6 3/4 inches. If you'll look at the first inside page of the Evening Times any day of the week, you'll see a photograph just that size. On the day after Edna's call, I bought a copy of the first edition of the Times. On the street at 10 in the morning, I had this scratcher friend of mine remove the photograph with acid and print this fake article in its place. Footnote: scratcher, forger, end of footnote. That evening I substituted a home edition outer sheet for the one that had come with the paper we have cooked up, and made a switch as soon as the doc's newsboy made his delivery. There was nothing to that part of it. The kid just tossed the paper into the vestibule. It's simply a case of duck into the doorway, trade papers, and go on, leaving the loaded one for the doc to read. I was trying not to look too interested, but my ears were cocked for every word. At the start, I had been prepared for a string of lies, but I knew now that he was telling me the truth. Every syllable was a boast. He was half drunk with appreciation of his own cleverness, the cleverness with which he had planned and carried out his program of treachery and murder. I knew that he was telling the truth, and I suspected that he was telling more of it than he had intended. He was fairly bloated with vanity, the vanity that fills the crook almost invariably after a little success, and makes him ripe for the pen. His eyes glistened, and his little mouth smiled triumphantly around the words that continued to roll out of it. The doc read the paper all right, and shot himself. But first he wrote and mailed a note to me. I didn't figure on his wife's being accused of killing him. That was plain luck. I figured that the fake piece in the paper would be overlooked in the excitement. Edna would then go forward, claiming to be his first wife, and his shooting himself after her first call, with what the nurse had overheard, would make his death seem a confession that Edna was his wife. I was sure that she would stand up under any sort of an investigation. Nobody knew anything about the doc's real past, except what he had told them, which would be found false. Edna had really married a Dr. Humbert Estep in Philadelphia in '96, and the 27 years that had passed since then would do a lot to hide the fact that Dr. Humbert Estep wasn't this Dr. Humbert Estep. All I wanted to do was convince the doc's real wife and her lawyers that she wasn't really his wife at all, and we did that. Everybody took it for granted that Edna was the legal wife. The next play would have been for Edna and the real wife to have reached some sort of an agreement about the estate, whereby Edna would have got the bulk, or at least half, of it, and nothing would have been made public. If worst came to worst, we were prepared to go to court. We were sitting pretty. But I'd have been satisfied with half the estate. It would have come to a few $100,000 at the least, and that would have been plenty for me, even deducting the $20,000 I had promised Edna. But when the police grabbed the doc's wife and charged her with his murder, I saw my way into the whole roll. All I had to do was sit tight and wait until they convicted her. Then the court would turn the entire pile over to Edna. I had the only evidence that would free the doc's wife, the note he had written me, but I couldn't, even if I had wanted to, have turned it in without exposing my hand. When he read that fake piece in the paper, he tore it out, wrote his message to me across the face of it, and sent it to me. So the note is a dead giveaway. However, I didn't have any intention of publishing it anyhow. Up to this point, everything had gone like a dream. All I had to do was wait until it was time to cash in on my brains, and that's the time that the real Humbert Estep picked out to mess up the works. He shaved his mustache off, put on some old clothes, and came snooping around to see that Edna and I didn't run out on him, as if he could have stopped us. After you put the finger on him for me, I brought him up here. I intended salving him along until I could find a place to keep him, until all the cards had been played. That's what I was going to hire you for, to take care of him. But he got to talking and wrangling, and I had to knock him down. He didn't get up, and I found that he was dead. His neck was broken. There was nothing to do but take him out to the park and leave him. I didn't tell Edna. She didn't have a lot of use for him as far as I could see, but you can't tell how women will take things. Anyhow, she'll stick now that it's done. She's on the up and up all the time, and if she should talk, she can't do a lot of damage. She only knows her own part of the lay. All this long-winded story is so you'll know just exactly what you're up against. Maybe you think you can dig up the proof of these things I have told you. You can this far. You can prove that Edna wasn't the doc's wife. You can prove that I've been blackmailing him. But you can't prove that the doc's wife didn't believe that Edna was his real wife. It's her word against Edna's and mine. We'll swear that we had convinced her of it, which will give her a motive. You can't prove that the phony news article I told you about ever existed. It'll sound like a hophead's dream to a jury. You can't tie last night's murder on me. I've got an alibi that will knock your hat off. I can prove that I left here with a friend of mine who was drunk, and that I took him to his hotel and put him to bed, with the help of a night clerk and a bellboy. And what have you got against that? The word of 2 private detectives. Who'll believe you? You can convict me of conspiracy to defraud or something, maybe. But regardless of that, you can't free Mrs. Estep without my help. Turn me loose, and I'll give you the letter the doc wrote me. It's the goods right enough, in his own handwriting, written across the face of the fake newspaper story, which ought to fit the torn place in the paper that the police are supposed to be holding. And he wrote that he was going to kill himself in words almost that plain. That would turn the trick, there was no doubt of it. And I believed Ledwich's story, The more I thought it over, the better I liked it. It fit into the facts everywhere. But I wasn't enthusiastic about giving this big crook his liberty. "Don't make me laugh," I said. "I'm going to put you away and free Mrs. Estep, both. Go ahead and try. You're up against it without the letter, and you don't think a man with brains enough to plan a job like this one would be foolish enough to leave the note where it could be found, do you?" I wasn't especially impressed with the difficulty of convicting this Ledwich and freeing the dead man's widow. His scheme, that cold-blooded zigzag of treachery for everybody he had dealt with, including his latest accomplice, Edna Estep, wasn't as airtight as he thought it. A week in which to run out a few lines in the East but a week was just what I didn't have. Vance Richmond's words were running through my head. But another day of imprisonment, 2 days, or perhaps even 2 hours, and she won't need anybody to clear her. Death will have done it. If I was going to do Mrs. Estep any good, I had to move quick. Law or no law, her life was in my fat hands. This man before me, his eyes bright and hopeful now, and his mouth anxiously pursed, was thief, blackmailer, double-crosser, and at least twice a murderer. I hated to let him walk out. But there was the woman, dying in a hospital. 12. Keeping my eye on Ledwich, I went to the telephone and got Vance Richmond on the wire at his residence. "How is Mrs. Estep?" I asked. "Weaker. I talked with the doctor half an hour ago, and he says—" I cut in on him. I didn't want to listen to the details. "Get over to the hospital and be where I can reach you by phone. I may have news for you before the night is over." "What? Is there a chance? Are you—" I didn't promise him anything. I hung up the receiver and spoke to Ledwich. "I'll do this much for you. Slip me the note, and I'll give you your gun and put you out the back door. There's a bull on the corner out front, and I can't take you past him." He was on his feet, beaming. "Your word on it?" he demanded. "Yes. Get going." He went past me to the phone, gave a number, which I made a note of, and then spoke hurriedly into the instrument. "This is Schuler. Put a boy in a taxi with that envelope I gave you to hold for me, and send him out here right away." He gave his address, said yes twice, and hung up. There was nothing surprising about his unquestioning acceptance of my word. He couldn't afford to doubt that I'd play fair with him. And also, all successful bunco men come in time to believe that the world, except for themselves, is populated by a race of human sheep who may be trusted to conduct themselves with true sheep-like docility. 10 minutes later the doorbell rang. We answered it together, and Ledwich took a large envelope from a messenger boy, while I memorized the number on the boy's cap. Then we were back to the front room. Ledwich slit the envelope and passed its contents to me. A piece of rough-torn newspaper. Across the face of the fake article he had told me about was written a message in a jerky hand. "I wouldn't have suspected you, Ledwich, of such profound stupidity. My last thought will be, this bullet that ends my life also ends your years of leisure. You'll have to go to work now. Estep." The doctor had died game. I took the envelope from the big man, put the death note in it, and put them in my pocket. Then I went to a front window, flattening a cheek against the glass until I could see O'Gara, dimly outlined in the night, patiently standing where I'd left him hours before. "The city dick is still on the corner," I told Ledwich. "Here's your gat," holding out the gun I had shot from his fingers a little while back. "Take it, and blow through the back door. Remember, that's all I'm offering you, the gun and a fair start. If you play fair with me, I'll not do anything to help find you, unless I have to keep myself in the clear. Fair enough." Footnote: Gat, gun. End of footnote. He grabbed the gun, broke it to see that it was still loaded, and wheeled toward the rear of the flat. At the door he pulled up, hesitated, and faced me again. I kept him covered with my automatic. "Will you do me one favor I didn't put in the bargain?" he asked. "What is it?" "That note of the doc's is in an envelope with my handwriting and maybe my fingerprints on it. Let me put it in a fresh envelope, will you? I don't want to leave any broader trail behind than I have to." With my left hand, my right being busy with the gun, I fumbled for the envelope and tossed it to him. He took a plain envelope from the table, wiped it carefully with his handkerchief, put the note in it, taking care not to touch it with the balls of his fingers, and passed it back to me, and I put it in my pocket. I had a hard time to keep from grinning in his face. That fumbling with the handkerchief told me that the envelope in my pocket was empty, that the death note was in Ledwidge's possession, though I hadn't seen it pass there. He had worked one of his bunco tricks upon me. "Beat it," I snapped, to keep from laughing in his face. He spun on his heel, his feet pounded against the floor, a door slammed in the rear. I tore into the envelope he had given me. I needed to be sure he had double-crossed me. The envelope was empty. Our agreement was wiped out. I sprang to the front window, threw it wide open and leaned out. O'Gara saw me immediately, clearer than I could see him. I swung my arm in a wide gesture toward the rear of the house. O'Gara set out for the alley on the run. I dashed back through Ledwidge's flat to the kitchen and stuck my head out of an already open window. I could see Ledwidge against the whitewashed fence, throwing the back gate open, plunging through it into the alley. O'Gara's squat bulk appeared under a light at the end of the alley. Ledwidge's revolver was in his hand. O'Gara's wasn't. Not quite. Ledwidge's gun swung up. The hammer clicked. O'Gara's gun coughed fire. Ledwidge fell with a slow revolving motion over the white fence, gasped once or twice, and went down in a pile. I walked slowly down the stairs to join O'Gara. Slowly, because it isn't a nice thing to look at a man you've deliberately sent to his death, not even if it's the surest way of saving an innocent life, and if the man who dies is a Jake Ledwidge, altogether treacherous. "How come?" O'Gara asked, when I came into the alley, where he stood looking down at the dead man. "He got out on me," I said simply. "He must have." I stooped and searched the dead man's pockets until I found the suicide note, still crumpled in the handkerchief. O'Gara was examining the dead man's revolver. "Look at it," he exclaimed. "Maybe this ain't my lucky day. He snapped at me once, and his gun missed fire. No wonder. Somebody must have been using an axe on it. The firing pins broke clean off." "Is that so?" I asked, just as if I hadn't discovered, when I first picked the revolver up, that the bullet which had knocked it out of Ledwidge's hand had made it harmless. Black Mask, March 1st, 1924. From the author of Zigzags of Treachery. I'll have another story riding your way in a day or two. One for the customers who don't like their sleuths to do too much brain work. The 4 rules for shadowing that I gave in Zigzags are the first and last words on the subject. There are no other tricks to learn. Follow them, and once you get the hang of it, shadowing is the easiest of detective work, except perhaps to an extremely nervous man. You simply saunter along somewhere within sight of your subject, and, barring bad breaks, the only thing that can make you lose him is over-anxiety on your own part. Even a clever criminal may be shadowed for weeks without suspecting it. I know one operative who shadowed a forger, a wily old hand, for more than 3 months without arousing his suspicion. I myself trailed one for 6 weeks, riding trains and making half a dozen small towns with him. And I'm not exactly inconspicuous, standing an inch or so over 6 feet. Another thing, a detective may shadow a man for days, and in the end have but the haziest idea of the man's features. Tricks of carriage, ways of wearing clothes, general outline, individual mannerisms, all as seen from the rear, are much more important to the shadow than faces. They can be recognized at a greater distance and do not necessitate getting in front of his subject at any time. Back, and it's only a couple years back, in the days before I decided that there was more fun in writing about manhunting than in that hunting, I wasn't especially fond of shadowing, though I had plenty of it to do. But I worked under one superintendent who needed only the flimsiest of excuses to desert his desk and get out on the street behind some suspect. Sincerely, Dashiell Hammett, San Francisco, California. 1 Hour by Dashiell Hammett, author of The 10th Clue. Like all of Mr. Hammett's detective stories, this tale starts with a very ordinary police case, and, just as you think you have it all figured out, it takes several unexpected turns and ends up with a bang. Chapter 1. This is Mr. Crostwaite, Vance Richmond said. Crostwaite, wedged between the arms of one of the attorney's large chairs, grunted what was perhaps meant for an acknowledgment of the introduction. I grunted back at him and found myself a chair. He was a big balloon of a man, this Crostwaite, in a green plaid suit that didn't make him look any smaller than he was. His tie was a gaudy thing, mostly of yellow, with a big diamond set in the center of it, and there were more stones on his pudgy hands. Spongy fat blurred his features, making it impossible for his round, purplish face to ever hold any other expression than the discontented hoggishness that was habitual to it. He reeked of gin. Mr. Crostwaite is the Pacific Coast agent for the Mutual Fire Extinguisher Manufacturing Company, Vance Richmond began, as soon as I had got myself seated. His office is on Kearny Street near California. Yesterday, at about 2:45 in the afternoon, he went to his office, leading his machine, a Hudson touring car, standing in front with the engine running. 10 minutes later, he came out. The car was gone. I looked at Crostwaite. He was looking at his fat knees, showing not the least interest in what his attorney was saying. I looked quickly back at Vance Richmond. His clean gray face and lean figure were downright beautiful beside his bloated client. A man named Newhouse, the lawyer was saying, who was the proprietor of a printing establishment on California Street, just around the corner from Mr. Crostwaite's office, was run down and killed by Mr. Crostwaite's car at the corner of Clay and Kearny Streets 5 minutes after Mr. Crostwaite had left the car to go into his office. The police found the car shortly afterward, only a block away from the scene of the accident, on Montgomery, near Clay. The thing is fairly obvious. Someone stole the car immediately after Mr. Crostwaite left it, and in driving rapidly away ran down Newhouse, and then, in fright, abandoned the car. But here is Mr. Crostwaite's position. 3 nights ago, while driving, perhaps a little recklessly, out drunk, Crostwaite said, not looking up from his plaid knees, and though his voice was hoarse, husky, it was the hoarseness of a whiskey-burnt throat. There was no emotion in his voice. While driving perhaps a little recklessly out Van Ness Avenue, Vance Richmond went on. ignoring the interruption. "Mr. Crosthwaite knocked a pedestrian down. The man wasn't badly hurt, and he is being compensated very generously for his injuries. But we are to appear in court next Monday to face a charge of reckless driving, and I am afraid that this accident of yesterday, in which the printer was killed, may hurt us. No one thinks that Mr. Crosthwaite was in his car when it killed the printer. We have a world of evidence that he wasn't. But I am afraid that the printer's death may be made a weapon against us when we appear on the Van Ness Avenue charge. Being an attorney, I know just how much capital the prosecuting attorney, if he so chooses, can make out of the really insignificant fact that the same car that knocked down the man on Van Ness Avenue killed another man yesterday. And, being an attorney, I know how likely the prosecuting attorney is to so choose, and he can handle it in such a way that we will be given little or no opportunity to tell our side. The worst that can happen, of course, is that, instead of the usual fine, Mr. Crosthwaite will be sent to the city jail for 30 or 60 days. That is bad enough, however, and that is what we wish to—" Crosthwaite spoke again, still regarding his knees. "Damned nuisance," he said. "That is what we wish to avoid," the attorney continued. "We are willing to pay a stiff fine, and expect to, for the accident on Van Ness Avenue was clearly Mr. Crosthwaite's fault. But we—" "Drunk as a lord," Crosthwaite said. "But we don't want to have this other accident, with which we had nothing to do, given a false weight in connection with the slighter accident. What we want, then, is to find the man or men who stole the car and ran down John Newhouse. If they are apprehended before we go to court, we won't be in danger of suffering for their act. Think you can find them before Monday?" "I'll try," I promised, "though it isn't—" The human balloon interrupted me by heaving himself to his feet, fumbling with his fat, jeweled fingers for his watch. "3 o'clock, he said. "Got a game of golf for 3:30. He picked up his hat and gloves from the desk. "Find 'em, will you? Damned nuisance going to jail." And he waddled out. Chapter 2. From the attorney's office, I went down to the Hall of Justice, and after hunting around a few minutes, found a policeman who had arrived at the corner of Clay and Kearny Streets a few seconds after Newhouse had been knocked down. "I was just leaving the hall when I seen a bus scoot around the corner at Clay Street," this patrolman, a big sandy-haired man named Coffee, told me. "Then I seen people gathering around, so I went up there and found this John Newhouse stretched out. He was already dead. Half a dozen people had seen him hit, and one of 'em had got the license number of the car that done it. We found the car standing empty just around the corner on Montgomery Street, pointing north. They was 2 fellas in the car when it hit Newhouse, but nobody saw what they looked like. Nobody was in it when we found it." "In what direction was Newhouse walking?" "North along Kearny Street, and he was about 3/4 across Clay when he was knocked. The car was coming north on Kearny, too, and turned east on Clay. It mightn't have been all the fault of the fellows in the car, according to them that seen the accident. Newhouse was walking across the street looking at a piece of paper in his hand. I found a piece of foreign money, paper money, in his hand, and I'd guess that's what he was looking at. The lieutenant tells me it was Dutch money. 100 florin note, he says." "Found out anything about the men in the car?" "Nothing. We lined up everybody we could find in the neighborhood of California and Kearny Streets, where the car was stolen from, and around Clay and Montgomery Streets, where it was left at. But nobody remembered seeing the fellows getting in it or getting out of it. The man that owns the car wasn't driving it. It was stole all right, I guess. At first I thought maybe they was something shady about the accident. This John Newhouse had a 2 or 3 day old black eye on him. But we run that out and found that he had a attack of heart trouble or something a couple days ago and fell, fetching his eye up against a chair. He'd been home sick for 3 days, just left his house half an hour or so before the accident. Where'd he live? On Sacramento Street, way out. I got his address here somewhere. He turned over the pages of a grimy memoranda book, and I got the dead man's house number, and the names and addresses of the witnesses to the accident that Coffee had questioned. That exhausted the policeman's information, so I left him. Chapter 3. My next play was to canvass the vicinity of where the car had been stolen and where it had been deserted, and then interview the witnesses. The fact that the police had fruitlessly gone over this ground made it unlikely that I would find anything of value, but I couldn't skip these things on that account. 99% of detective work is a patient collecting of details, and your details must be got as nearly first-hand as possible, regardless of who else has worked the territory before you. Before starting on this angle, however, I decided to run around to the dead man's printing establishment, only 3 blocks from the Hall of Justice, and see if any of his employees had heard anything that might help me. Newhouse's establishment occupied the ground floor of a small building on California, between Kearny and Montgomery. A small office was partitioned off in front, with a connecting doorway leading to the press room in the rear. The only occupant of the small office, when I came in from the street, was a short, stocky, worried-looking blond man of 40 or thereabouts, who sat at the desk in his shirt sleeves, checking off figures in a ledger against others on a batch of papers before him. I introduced myself, telling him that I was a Continental Detective Agency operative interested in Newhouse's death. He told me his name was Ben Souls, and that he was Newhouse's foreman. We shook hands, and then he waved me to a chair across the desk, pushed back the papers and books upon which he had been working, and scratched his head disgustedly with the pencil in his hand. "This is awful," he said. "What with one thing and another, we're heels over head in work, and I got to fool with these books that I don't know anything at all about, and—" He broke off to pick up the telephone, which had jingled. "Yes? This is Souls. We're working on them now. I'll give 'em to you by Monday noon at the least. I know we promised them for yesterday, but—" I know. But the boss's death set us back. Explain that to Mr. Crosthwaite, and I'll promise you that we'll give them to you Monday morning, sure." Souls slapped the receiver irritably on its hook and looked at me. "You'd think that since it was his own car that killed the boss, he'd have decency enough not to squawk over the delay." Crosthwaite? Yes, that was one of his clerks. We're printing some leaflets for him. Promised to have 'em ready yesterday, but between the boss's death and having a couple new hands to break in, we're behind with everything. I've been here 8 years, and this is the first time we ever fell down on an order, and every damned customer is yelling his head off. If we were like most printers, they'd be used to waiting. But we've been too good to them. But this Crosthwaite, you'd think he'd have some decency, seeing that his car killed the boss." I nodded sympathetically, slid a cigar across the desk, and waited until it was burning in Souls' mouth before I asked, "You said something about having a couple new hands to break in. How come?" "Yes, Mr. Newhouse fired 2 of our printers last week, Fincher and Key. He found that they belonged to the IWW, so he gave them their time." "Any trouble with them, or anything against them, except that they were wobblies?" "No, they were pretty good workers." "Any trouble with them after he fired them?" I asked. No real trouble, though they were pretty hot. They made red speeches all over the place before they left. Remember what day that was? Wednesday of last week, I think. Yes, Wednesday. Because I hired 2 new men on Thursday. How many men do you work? 3, besides myself. Was Mr. Newhouse sick very often? Not sick enough to stay away very often, though every now and then his heart would go back on him, and he'd have to stay in bed for a week or 10 days. He wasn't what you could call real well at any time. He never did anything but the office work. I run the shop. When was he taken sick this last time? Mrs. Newhouse called up Tuesday morning and said he had had another spell and wouldn't be down for a few days. He came in yesterday, which was Thursday, for about 10 minutes in the afternoon, and said he would be back on the job this morning. He was killed just after he left. How did he look? Very sick? Not so bad. He never looked well, of course, but I couldn't see much difference from usual yesterday. This last spell hadn't been as bad as most, I reckon. He was usually laid up for a week or more. Did he say where he was going when he left? The reason I ask is that, living out on Sacramento Street, he would naturally have taken a car at that street if he had been going home, whereas he was run down on Clay Street. He said he was going up to Portsmouth Square to sit in the sun for half an hour or so. He had been cooped up indoors for 2 or 3 days, he said, and he wanted some sunshine before he went back home. He had a piece of foreign money in his hand when he was hit. Know anything about it? Yes, he got it here. One of our customers, a man named Van Pelt, came in to pay for some work we had done yesterday afternoon while the boss was here. When Van Pelt pulled out his wallet to pay his bill, this piece of Holland money, I don't know what you call it, was among the bills. I think he said it was worth something like $38. Anyway, the boss took it, giving Van Pelt his change. The boss said he wanted to show the Holland money to his boys, and he could have it changed back into American money later. Who is this Van Pelt? He's a Hollander, is planning to open a tobacco importing business here in a month or 2. I don't know much about him outside of that. Where's his home or office? His office is on Bush Street, near Sansom. Did he know that Newhouse had been sick? I don't think so. The boss didn't look much different from usual. What's this Van Pelt's full name? Hendrik Van Pelt. What does he look like? Before Souls could answer, 3 evenly spaced buzzes sounded above the rattle and whirring of the presses in the back of the shop. I slid the muzzle of my gun. I had been holding it in my lap for 5 minutes, far enough over the edge of the desk for Ben Souls to see it. Put both of your hands on top of the desk, I said. He put them there. The press room door was directly behind him, so that, facing him across the desk, I could look over his shoulder at it. His stocky body served to screen my gun from the view of whoever came through the door in response to Souls' signal. I didn't have long to wait. 3 men, black with ink, came to the door and threw it into the little office. They strolled in careless and casual, laughing and joking to one another. But one of them licked his lips as he stepped through the door. Another's eyes showed white circles all around the irises. The third was the best actor, but he held his shoulders a trifle too stiffly to fit his otherwise careless carriage. Stop right there. I barked at them when the last one was inside the office. And I brought my gun up where they could see it. They stopped as if they had all been mounted on the same pair of legs. I kicked my chair back and stood up. I didn't like my position at all. The office was entirely too small for me. I had a gun, true enough, and whatever weapons may have been distributed among these other men were out of sight. But these 4 men were too close to me, and a gun, isn't a thing of miracles. It's a mechanical contraption that is capable of just so much and no more. If these men decided to jump me, I could down just one of them before the other three were upon me. I knew it, and they knew it. "Put your hands up," I ordered, "and turn around." None of them moved to obey. One of the inked men grinned wickedly. Souls shook his head slowly. The other two stood and looked at me. I was more or less stumped. You can't shoot a man just because he refuses to obey an order, even if he is a criminal. If they had turned around for me, I could have lined them up against the wall, and, being behind them, have held them safe while I used the telephone. But that hadn't worked. My next thought was to back across the office to the street door, keeping them covered, and then either stand in the door and yell for help, or take them into the street where I could handle them. But I put that thought away as quickly as it came to me. These 4 men were going to jump me. There was no doubt of that. All that was needed was a spark of any sort to explode them into action. They were standing stiff-legged and tense, waiting for some move on my part. If I took a step backward, the battle would be on. We were close enough for any of the 4 to have reached out and touched me. One of them I could shoot before I was smothered. 1 out of 4. That meant that each of them had only 1 chance out of 4 of being the victim. Low enough odds for any but the most cowardly of men. I grinned, what was supposed to be a confident grin, because I was up against it hard, and reached for the telephone. I had to do something. Then I cursed myself. I had merely changed the signal for the onslaught. It would come now when I picked up the receiver. But I couldn't back down again. That, too, would be a signal. I had to go through with it. The perspiration trickled across my temples from under my hat as I drew the phone closer with my left hand. The street door opened. An exclamation of surprise came from behind me. I spoke rapidly, without taking my eyes from the 4 men in front of me. "Quick, the phone! The police!" With the arrival of this unknown person, one of Newhouse's customers probably, I figured I had the edge again. Even if he took no active part beyond calling the police in, the enemy would have to split to take care of him, and that would give me a chance to pot at least 2 of them before I was knocked over. 2 out of 4, each of them had an even chance of being dropped, which is enough to give even a nervy man cause for thinking a bit before he jumps. "Hurry," I urged the newcomer. Yes, he said, and in the blurred sound of the yes, there was evidence of foreign birth. Keyed up as I was, I didn't need any more warning than that. I threw myself sideways, a blind tumbling away from the spot where I stood, but I wasn't quite quick enough. The blow that came from behind didn't hit me fairly, but I got enough of it to fold up my legs as if the knees were hinged with paper, and I slammed into a heap on the floor. Something dark crashed toward me. I caught her with both hands. It may have been a foot kicking at my face. I wrung it as a washerwoman wrings a towel. Down my spine ran jar after jar. Perhaps someone was beating me over the head. I don't know. My head wasn't alive. The blow that had knocked me down had numbed me all over. My eyes were no good. Shadows swam to and fro in front of them. That was all. I struck, gouged, tore at the shadows. Sometimes I found nothing. Sometimes I found things that felt like parts of bodies. Then I would hammer at them, tear at them. My gun was gone. My hearing was no better than my sight. Or not so good. There wasn't a sound in the world. I moved in a silence that was more complete than any silence I had ever known. I was a ghost fighting ghosts. I found presently that my feet were under me again, though some squirming thing was on my back and kept me from standing upright. A hot, damp thing like a hand was across my face. I put my teeth into it. I snapped my head back as far as it would go. Maybe it smashed into the face it was meant for. I don't know. Anyhow, the squirming thing was no longer on my back. Dimly I realized that I was being buffeted about by blows that I was too numb to feel. Ceaselessly, with head and shoulders and elbows and fists and knees and feet, I struck at the shadows that were around me. Suddenly I could see again. Not clearly, but the shadows were taking on colors, and my ears came back a little, so that grunts and growls and curses and the impact of blows sounded in them. My straining gaze rested upon a brass cuspidor 6 inches or so in front of my eyes. I knew then that I was down on the floor again. As I twisted about to hurl a foot into a soft body above me, something that was like a burn but wasn't a burn ran down one leg. A knife. The sting of it brought consciousness back into me with a rush. I grabbed the brass cuspidor and used it to club a way to my feet, to club a clear space in front of me. Men were hurling themselves upon me. I swung the cuspidor high and flung it over their heads, through the frosted glass door into California Street. Then we fought some more. But you can't throw a brass cuspidor through a glass door into California Street between Montgomery and Kearny without attracting attention. It's too near the heart of daytime San Francisco. So, presently, when I was on the floor again with 600 or 800 pounds of flesh hammering my face into the boards, we were pulled apart, and I was dug out of the bottom of the pile by a squad of policemen. Big, sandy-haired Coffee was one of them, but it took a lot of arguing to convince him that I was the Continental operative who had talked to him a little while before. Man, he said, when I finally convinced him. Them lads sure, God, have worked you over. You got a face on you like a wet geranium. I didn't laugh. It wasn't funny. I looked out of the one eye, which was working just now, at the 5 men lined up across the office. Souls, the 3 inky printers, and the man with the blurred S, who had started the slaughter by tapping me on the back of the head. He was a rather tall man of 30 or so, with a round, ruddy face that wore a few bruises now. He had been, apparently, rather well dressed in expensive black clothing, but he was torn and ragged now. I knew who he was without asking. Hendrik Van Pelt. "Well, man, what's the answer?" Coffee was asking me. By holding one side of my jaw firmly with one hand, I found that I could talk without too much pain. "This is the crowd that ran down Newhouse," I said, "and it wasn't an accident. I wouldn't mind having a few more of the details myself, but I was jumped before I got around to all of them. Newhouse had a 100-florin note in his hand when he was run down, and he was walking in the direction of police headquarters, was only half a block away from the Hall of Justice. Souls tells me that Newhouse said he was going up to Portsmouth Square to sit in the sun. But Souls didn't seem to know that Newhouse was wearing a black eye, the one you told me you had investigated. If Souls didn't see the shiner, then it's a good bet that Souls didn't see Newhouse's face that day. Newhouse was walking from his printing shop toward police headquarters with a piece of foreign paper money in his hand. Remember that. He had frequent spells of sickness, which, according to friend Souls, always before kept him at home for a week or 10 days at a time. This time he was laid up for only 2.5 days. Souls tells me that the shop is 3 days behind with its orders, and he says that's the first time in 8 years they've ever been behind. He blames Newhouse's death, which only happened yesterday. Apparently Newhouse's previous sick spells never delayed things. Why should this last spell? 2 printers were fired last week, and 2 new ones hired the very next day. Pretty quick work. The car with which Newhouse was run down was taken from just round the corner, and was deserted within quick walking distance of the shop. It was left facing north. which is pretty good evidence that its occupants went south after they got out. Ordinary car thieves wouldn't have circled back in the direction from which they came. Here's my guess. This Van Pelt is a Dutchman, and he had some plates for phony 100 florin notes. He hunted around until he found a printer who would go in with him. He found Souls, the foreman of a shop whose proprietor was now and then at home for a week or more at a time with a bad heart. One of the printers under Souls was willing to go in with them. Maybe the other two turned the offer down. Maybe Souls didn't ask them at all. Anyhow, they were discharged, and two friends of Souls were given their places. Our friends then got everything ready and waited for Newhouse's heart to flop again. It did, Monday night. As soon as his wife called up next morning and said he was sick, these birds started running off their counterfeits. That's why they fell behind with their regular work. But this spell of Newhouse's was lighter than usual. He was up and moving around within 2 days, and yesterday afternoon he came down here for a few minutes. You must have walked in while all of our friends were extremely busy in some far corner. He must have spotted some of the phony money, immediately sized up the situation, grabbed one bill to show the police, and started out for police headquarters, no doubt thinking he had not been seen by our friends here. They must have got a glimpse of him as he was leaving, however. 2 of them followed him out. They couldn't, afoot, safely knock him over within a block or 2 of the Hall of Justice, but turning the corner, they found Crosthwaite's car standing there with idling engine. That solved their getaway problem. They got in the car and went on after Newhouse. I suppose the original plan was to shoot him, but he crossed Clay Street with his eyes fastened upon the phony money in his hand. That gave them a golden chance. They piled the car into him. It was sure death, they knew. His bum heart would finish the job if the actual collision didn't kill him. Then they deserted the car and came back here. There are a lot of loose ends to be gathered in, but this pipe dream I just told you fits in with all the facts we know, and I'll bet a month's salary I'm not far off anywhere. There ought to be a 3-day crop of Dutch notes cached somewhere. You people... I suppose I'd have gone on talking forever in the giddy, head-swimming intoxication of utter exhaustion that filled me, if the big sandy-haired patrolman hadn't shut me off by putting a big hand across my mouth. "Be quiet, man," he said, lifting me out of the chair and spreading me flat on my back on the desk. "I'll have an ambulance here in a second for you." The office was swirling around in front of my one open eye. The yellow ceiling swung down toward me, rose again, disappeared, came back in odd shapes. I turned my head to one side to avoid it, and my glance rested upon the white dial of a spinning clock. Presently, the dial came to rest, and I read it. 4 o'clock. I remembered that Crosthwaite had broken up our conference in Vance Richmond's office at 3, and I had started to work. 1 full hour. I tried to tell Coffee before I went to sleep. The police wound up the job while I was lying on my back in bed. In Van Pelt's office on Bush Street, they found a great bale of 100-florin notes. Van Pelt, they learned, had considerable reputation in Europe as a high-class counterfeiter. One of the printers came through, stating that Van Pelt and Souls were the 2 who followed Newhouse out of the shop and killed him.